The scream tore through the night, before Wren Calloway even understood why she was running. Her bare feet slapped against cold stone, as she pushed through the crowd of she-wolves gathered outside the great iron gates of Ashwood Hold. Somewhere behind her, a girl had collapsed, foam at her lips, her body twisting in a way that no healthy wolf should twist. Guards shouted. Torches swung wildly, throwing long shadows across thousands of frightened faces. Wren pressed herself against a stone pillar, heart hammering, and watched as two healers dragged the convulsing girl away through the crowd. This was supposed to be an honor. This was supposed to be the greatest night of 10,000 young women's lives. Instead, on the very first hour of the selection, someone had already been poisoned. Wren did not know the girl's name. She did not know if the poisoning was an accident, a punishment, or a warning, aimed at every candidate who dared to dream of becoming Luna, to the White Lycan King. All she knew was that her own hands were shaking, and that she had never wanted to be here in the first place. 3 days earlier, her pack alpha, Garrick Wells, had called her into his study and told her, without a shred of warmth, that she would be attending the selection. Not because he believed she had any chance of winning, not because he saw anything special in her. He needed a name on the roster, a body to fill the quota every pack owed the crown, and Wren was the easiest one to spare. An Omega with a ruined voice was worth little to a pack like his. Sending her away cost him nothing. She had wanted to refuse. She had wanted to run into the deep woods behind her pack's territory and disappear the way she always did when the world grew too loud and too cruel. But refusing a royal summons meant punishment for her entire pack, not just for her. And Wren had spent her whole life trying to be small enough, quiet enough, that no one would ever have to pay a price for her. So she had packed a single bag, said goodbye to no one, and traveled 3 days by cart to the hold of the most powerful wolf in the territory. Now, standing in the chaos of the first night, watching healers vanish through a side door with an unconscious candidate in their arms, Wren understood with total clarity that she had walked straight into a battlefield disguised as a fairy tale. The gates finally groaned open, and a voice, deep, commanding, carrying easily over 10,000 heads without any visible effort, called the crowd to order. Move forward. Single file, no pushing. Wren's eyes lifted toward the source of that voice, and for the first time in her life, she understood what people meant when they said a person could fill a room simply by existing in it. Kate Ashwood stood at the top of the stone steps leading into the hold, flanked by his personal guard. He wore no crown, no ceremonial furs, nothing to announce his rank, except the way every wolf around him instinctively lowered their eyes. He did not need decoration. His presence alone silenced the crying, the shouting, the frightened murmurs rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. He was younger than Wren had expected, though his eyes held none of the softness of youth. Pale hair, sharp jaw, a stillness to his body that reminded her of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort of chasing. Rumors said his wolf form was the color of fresh snow, rare among Lycans, rarer still among kings. Rumors said he had never lost a single fight in his life. Rumors said he had buried both of his parents before his 18th birthday, and had ruled ever since, with a coldness that made even seasoned alphas hesitate to challenge him. Wren believed every rumor the moment she saw his face. He surveyed the crowd of candidates with the detached interest of a man counting cattle, his gaze sweeping row after row without pause, without recognition, without a flicker of the excitement every other girl around Wren seemed to be radiating. Some of them were crying, some were pressing their hands to their chests as though simply breathing near him was overwhelming. One girl fainted entirely and had to be caught by the candidates beside her. Wren did none of these things. She kept her head down and her shoulders small, exactly the way she had learned to do since childhood, and she prayed his gaze would pass over her the way it passed over everyone else. It did. For half a second, relief loosened the knot in her chest. Then a hand closed around her wrist. She flinched, biting down the instinct to cry out, though even if she had wanted to scream, her damaged throat would have only produced a raw, broken sound instead of words. The guard holding her arm did not look unkind, only impatient, herding the candidates forward in orderly lines toward the registration tables set up along the courtyard. Name. The registration clerk barked without looking up. Wren's throat tightened. She reached instead for the small wooden tablet hanging from a cord around her neck, the one she had carved herself years ago, and turned it so the clerk could read the letters scratched into its surface. WRENCALLOWAY. Pack of Garrick Wells. Omega rank. The clerk glanced at the tablet, then at Ren, then made a small mark beside her name that told her exactly what he thought of her chances. Omega candidates were rarely taken seriously. Most packs sent their Omegas purely to satisfy the quota, the same way Garrick had sent her. And everyone in this courtyard understood the unspoken hierarchy perfectly well. Alpha's daughters at the top, Beta's daughters in the middle, Omegas at the very bottom, present only because tradition demanded every rank be represented. "Move along," the clerk said, already looking past her toward the next candidate in line. Ren moved along. The hold swallowed the candidates whole, corridor after corridor of cold gray stone, lit by torches that threw restless shadows across ancient tapestries, depicting wolves in battle, wolves in triumph, wolves bowing before crowned figures, whose faces had faded with age. Ren tried to memorize the turns, the doorways, anything that might help her find her way back, if she ever needed to escape quickly. She had learned long ago that knowing your exits was the first rule of survival. She was led, along with perhaps 30 other candidates, into a long dormitory hall lined with narrow beds. A woman in gray robes, introduced only as Matron Ellery, explained the rules in a clipped, efficient voice. Candidates would rise before dawn. Trials would begin on the second day. Any candidate caught fighting, stealing, or breaking curfew would be expelled from the selection immediately, sent home in disgrace. The king's word was law within these walls, and his council would oversee every trial personally. "And the girl who collapsed tonight?" one candidate asked, her voice trembling. "Will she be all right?" Matron Ellery's expression flattened into something unreadable. "That is not your concern. Rest now. Tomorrow begins the moment the sun rises." No one slept well that night. Ren lay on her narrow cot, staring at the stone ceiling, listening to the quiet sobs of homesick girls around her, and the restless whispers of ambitious ones, already plotting how to catch the king's eye. She thought of her own pack's territory, the quiet stream behind her cabin, the way morning light fell through the pine trees when she went walking alone before anyone else woke. She thought of how much she wanted to simply survive this selection and go home to that quiet, unnoticed life. She did not think, not even once, that the white Lycan king might ever look at her twice. Morning came too soon. Ren rose with the others, dressed in the plain gray uniform provided to every candidate, and followed the crowd down to the training courtyard, where the first trial would take place. Word had already spread about the poisoned candidate. Some said she had survived, others whispered that she had not. No one seemed to know for certain, and the uncertainty hung over the courtyard like a storm cloud waiting to break. The council members arrived first, 7 stern-faced wolves seated at a long table beneath a canopy, and then, a few minutes later, Cade himself. He said nothing as he took his seat at the center of the table. He did not smile. He did not offer any encouraging words to the thousands of hopeful young women standing before him, many of whom had traveled from distant packs, specifically for the chance to earn his favor. He simply nodded once to his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Callan, and the first trial began. It was a test of etiquette and composure. Candidates called forward in small groups to answer questions posed by the council about pack law, diplomacy, and the responsibilities of a Luna. Ren watched as girl after girl stepped forward with practiced confidence, reciting answers they had clearly rehearsed for months, some of them glancing toward Cade with hopeful, searching eyes, as though desperate for even the smallest sign of approval. He gave none. His expression remained utterly unreadable through the entire morning, and Ren began to understand why the rumors described him as cold. He was not cruel, not exactly. He simply did not perform emotion the way everyone around him seemed to expect. When her own group was finally called forward, Ren's stomach dropped. She had known this moment was coming. She had known, the instant Garrick told her she would be attending the selection, that eventually, she would have to stand before the council and somehow answer their questions, despite a voice that had never fully recovered from the attack that scarred her throat as a child. She had practiced sign language for years, had learned to write quickly and clearly, had found small ways to communicate that worked well enough among people who knew her. But here, before the king's council, before thousands of watching eyes, none of those quiet workarounds would matter. Here, silence would simply look like failure. "State your understanding of a Luna's duty to her pack," one council member asked, looking directly at Ren. Ren opened her mouth. A faint, broken rasp emerged, nothing close to actual words, and she watched the council member's expression shift from mild interest to open pity in the space of a single breath. Laughter rippled through a cluster of candidates nearby, quickly stifled, but not quickly enough that Ren didn't hear it. Her face burned. She reached instead for the small slate tablet she carried, the one she used for exactly these situations, and began writing her answer as fast as her trembling hand allowed. But the council had already moved on. "Next candidate," the same member said, waving Ren aside without waiting for her written response, as though she had already proven herself unworthy of further attention. Ren stepped back into the crowd, slate still in hand, her answer unread and unheard. Shame settled over her like a heavy cloak, familiar and suffocating. This was exactly what she had feared. This was exactly why she had never wanted to come. She did not notice, in that moment, the pair of pale eyes that had lifted from the council table and fixed, briefly but unmistakably, on her retreating figure. She did not notice that for the first time since the trials began, the white Lycan king's carefully blank expression had flickered, not with pity, and not with dismissal, but with something closer to curiosity. The trial continued for hours, group after group called forward, question after question, answered with varying degrees of confidence and skill. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Ren had folded herself into the back rows of candidates, hoping to disappear entirely for the rest of the day. She had already failed the first trial as thoroughly as she had expected to, and there was some strange relief in that failure, as though the worst had already happened, and now she could simply exist quietly until the selection ended and sent her home. She did not know that her worst assumption, that she had already become invisible to the king, could not have been further from the truth. She did not know that somewhere behind the long council table, Kate Ashwood had already asked Callan, in a low voice meant for no one else, exactly which candidate had just been dismissed without being heard. And she certainly did not know that this single, quiet question would set into motion a chain of events that would change the rest of her life. By evening, the candidates were released from the courtyard and sent to gather in the great dining hall for their first meal within the hold. Long wooden tables stretched from one end of the room to the other, filled with more food than Ren had ever seen in one place, roasted meats and fresh bread, and bowls of fruit that must have been carried in from warmer territories. She took a small portion of everything, more out of habit than hunger, and found a quiet corner seat away from the clusters of candidates already trading gossip about the day's trial. She listened despite herself. Everyone was talking about the same three things. The poisoned girl, who had apparently survived but would not be returning to the selection. The strongest candidates, whose names were already being repeated with a kind of reverent awe, especially one called Celine Draven, daughter of an allied alpha, said to be the clear favorite before the trials had even begun, and the king himself, whose silence throughout the day had left every candidate desperate to interpret his blank expression as some hidden sign of interest. No one mentioned Ren at all. She was, as always, invisible, and on this particular night, invisible felt like exactly what she wanted to be. She finished her meal quickly and slipped away from the hall before the noise grew too overwhelming, making her way back through the maze of corridors toward the dormitory. She had almost reached the safety of her narrow cot when a voice stopped her in the hallway, low and unfamiliar, carrying an authority that made her spine straighten on instinct alone. "You were the one who couldn't answer today." Ren turned and found herself face to face with Callan, the king's second-in-command, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight. She said nothing, because she had nothing to say that her voice could carry, and simply waited for whatever judgment he had come to deliver. But no judgment came. Instead, Callan studied her for a long moment, his eyes flicking briefly to the slate tablet she still carried at her side, and then, without further explanation, he turned and walked away, leaving Ren standing alone in the corridor, with her heart pounding for reasons she could not yet name. She did not sleep easily that night either, but for the first time since arriving at Ashwood Hold, her sleeplessness was not entirely made of dread. The second trial began with a fight that nearly cost a candidate her life. Ren stood near the edge of the sparring circle, watching two she-wolves in animal form circle each other beneath the cold morning sky, claws bared, hackles raised. The council had called this trial a test of strength and discipline, but discipline seemed to have vanished the moment the two wolves lunged at each other in a blur of fur and teeth. One of them, a tall beta candidate named Ida, misjudged her opponent's speed and took a bite along her shoulder deep enough to draw a collective gasp from the watching crowd. Guards rushed forward to separate the wolves before real damage was done, and healers hurried Ida away, her shoulder wrapped tightly, her face pale with pain. The trial paused only long enough for the blood to be cleared from the stones before the next pair was called forward. Ren's stomach churned. She had never been comfortable with violence, not after what had happened to her as a child, and watching candidates tear into each other for the king's approval made her wonder, not for the first time, what kind of man would want a mate chosen through such a display. She glanced toward the council table, where Cade sat exactly as he had the day before, still and unreadable, watching the sparring matches with the detached focus of a man evaluating livestock rather than choosing a life partner. And yet, Ren noticed something she had missed the previous day. His eyes did not simply pass over the crowd of candidates waiting their turn. They searched, deliberate and slow, scanning row after row, as though looking for someone specific. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings looked at crowds all the time. It was foolish to imagine his search had anything to do with her. Her own turn in the sparring circle came sooner than she wanted. Omega candidates were paired against each other by rank, a small mercy that meant Ren would not have to face a beta or alpha opponent, but a mercy that offered little comfort given her opponent was a wiry, quick Omega named Fenna, who had clearly trained harder than Ren ever had. The moment the trial master gave the signal, Fenna shifted into her wolf form and lunged. Ren barely managed to sidestep the attack, her own shift slower, less practiced, her wolf form smaller, and less confident than she needed it to be in that moment. Fenna's teeth grazed her flank, not deep enough to wound seriously, but enough to send a jolt of pain through her body, and a fresh wave of humiliation through her mind. She did not fight back the way the crowd seemed to expect. Instead, she used what little speed she had to keep distance between herself and Fenna, circling, dodging, refusing to engage in the kind of aggressive display that clearly won favor with the watching council. The match ended not in victory, but in a stalemate the trial master eventually called, simply because neither wolf had managed to pin the other. Ren shifted back to her human form, breathing hard, a thin line of blood trickling down her arm where Fenna's claws had caught her during one of the exchanges. She expected mockery. She expected the same dismissive wave the council had given her during the first trial. Instead, she caught Cade's gaze fixed directly on her, and for the first time, he did not look away when their eyes met. The moment lasted only a few seconds, before a healer stepped in front of her to examine her wound, blocking her view of the council table entirely. When the healer moved aside again, Cade's attention had already returned to the next pair of candidates entering the circle, his expression as unreadable as ever. Ren told herself, again, that it meant nothing. That evening, exhaustion and confusion tangled together inside her as she made her way toward the kitchens instead of the dining hall, craving quiet more than food. The kitchen staff, mostly older wolves, who had served the hold for decades, barely glanced up as she slipped inside and settled onto a low bench near the hearth. She had always found comfort in kitchens, in the simple rhythm of chopping and stirring, and the warm, homey smell of bread rising, a comfort that reminded her faintly of her own mother, long gone now, who had taught her to cook before the attack that took her voice, had also taken most of her childhood joy. It was there, in the flickering firelight of the kitchen, that she first met Milo. He was young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, the son of one of the kitchen workers, and he sat curled in the corner nursing a bandaged hand, tears streaking silently down his face, as he tried and failed to keep from crying in front of the adults bustling around him. No one seemed to have time to comfort him properly, too busy with the endless demands of feeding thousands of candidates and staff alike. Ren slid off her bench and knelt beside him without a second thought. She could not speak to him with words, but she had long ago learned other ways to offer comfort. She held out her own hands, gently turning them, so he could see the faint scars along her wrists, old wounds from her own childhood, a silent way of saying, "I understand pain too." Milo's crying slowed as he studied her scars, his curiosity temporarily overtaking his own hurt. Ren carefully examined his bandaged hand, humming a soft, wordless tune under her breath, the only sound her damaged throat could still produce with any real gentleness. She stayed with him for nearly an hour, using simple signs and gentle humming to distract him from his pain, occasionally writing small words on a scrap of parchment to make him smile. By the time his mother finally found a moment to check on him, Milo had stopped crying entirely and was instead trying, with great concentration, to copy the hand signs Ren had shown him. "Thank you," his mother said, exhaustion evident in her voice. Not many of the candidates would bother. Ren simply shook her head, as if to say it was nothing, and slipped quietly out of the kitchen before anyone else could notice her there. She did not know that Cade had entered the kitchen corridor only minutes earlier, intending to request a private meal away from the noise of the dining hall, and had paused, unseen in the shadow of a doorway, to watch the entire exchange unfold. He watched Ren kneel beside a crying child, with no audience to impress and no advantage to gain. He watched her offer comfort, using nothing but her hands, and a hum too soft for most ears to catch. He watched her slip away the moment her task was done, refusing even a proper thank you, as though recognition made her uncomfortable rather than pleased. In 3 days of watching thousands of candidates perform devotion, ambition, and grace for his benefit, this was the first unguarded moment he had witnessed. The first thing that felt real. He returned to his private study that night deeply unsettled, unable to explain even to himself why the memory of a silent Omega, kneeling beside a crying child, lingered so persistently in his mind, refusing to be pushed aside by the mountain of council reports waiting on his desk. The next morning, he summoned Callan before the sun had even fully risen. "The Omega from Garrick Wells's pack," Cade said, without preamble. "Calloway, tell me what you know of her." Callan, unused to his king requesting information about a low-ranked candidate, raised an eyebrow, but did not question the order. By midday, he returned with what little the Hold's records could offer. An Omega, ranked lowest among the current candidates by the council's own assessment. Unable to speak due to an old injury sustained in childhood, sent to the selection not by her own choice, but at her alpha's command, purely to satisfy the quota owed to the crown. "She has no allies among the other candidates," Callan added. "No family here to advocate for her. By every measure the council uses, she has almost no chance of advancing past the early trials." Cade said nothing for a long moment, staring out the window of his study toward the training courtyard below, where the third trial was already being prepared. "And yet," he finally said, "she is the only candidate in this entire selection who has not once tried to gain my attention." Callan hesitated. "Is that a mark in her favor, my lord, or against it?" Cade did not answer directly. Instead, he asked a single question that would set the next several days into motion. "When does the council review the rankings again?" "Tomorrow evening, my lord." "Good," Cade said. "I want to observe the review personally this time." Callan's confusion was obvious, though he was wise enough not to voice it. In all the years he had served as second in command, Cade had never once involved himself directly in the council's ranking discussions, trusting his advisors to manage the early trials without his interference. That he would choose to break that pattern now, over a candidate the council had already dismissed as unremarkable, told Callan something important, even if his king had not yet said it aloud. Something about the silent Omega had caught the White Lycan King's attention, and whatever it was not going to be easily ignored. Meanwhile, in the dormitory hall, Celine Draven was holding court among a circle of admiring candidates, recounting her performance in the sparring trial, with the confident polish of someone who had never once doubted her own success. She was tall and striking, with dark hair braided in the elaborate style favored by her home pack, and a voice that carried easily across any room she entered. Everyone agreed she was the clear favorite, and Celine herself seemed to agree most of all. "Did you see how the king watched me during my match?" she said, tilting her chin with satisfaction. He barely blinked. One of her companions, a beta candidate named Ottilie, nodded eagerly. "Everyone says you'll be named top candidate at tomorrow's review." Celine smiled, but her eyes drifted briefly across the room, landing on the empty cot near the far wall, where Ren usually sat quietly mending her uniform before sleep. She had noticed, as had a few others, the king's lingering glance during the sparring match, though she had dismissed it easily enough. An Omega with a broken voice was no threat to a candidate like her. The very idea was almost laughable. "Where is the mute girl tonight?" Ottilie asked, following Celine's gaze. "Who cares?" Celine said, waving a dismissive hand. "She won't last past the third trial anyway. None of the low ranks ever do." The conversation moved on quickly, the way such conversations always did, among candidates far more interested in their own prospects than in a girl most of them had barely noticed existed. But the seed of Celine's dismissal would, in time, grow into something far more dangerous than simple indifference. Ren, unaware of the conversation happening in the dormitory, spent that same evening in the small infirmary wing, checking on Milo one final time before the household settled for the night. The boy's hand was healing well, the healer assured her, though he still refused to sleep without someone sitting nearby, a habit born of the fear that came with any injury at his young age. Ren stayed until his breathing evened into the steady rhythm of real sleep, then slipped quietly back toward the dormitory, through the same servants' corridor she had used the night before. It was in that corridor, half lit by a single flickering torch, that she nearly walked directly into Cade himself. She froze instantly, dropping her gaze on instinct, every instinct in her body screaming at her to bow, to apologize, to somehow make herself smaller, before the most powerful wolf in the territory. But Cade did not move past her the way she expected. He stood there instead, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with a feeling she could not name, something caught between fear and an entirely different, more confusing sensation. "You were in the kitchen last night," he said finally, his voice low, quieter than the commanding tone he used during the trials. It was not a question. Ren's pulse quickened. She nodded once, unsure what else to do. "With the boy. Milo." Another nod, her eyes still fixed somewhere near his boots, unable to bring herself to meet his gaze directly. "Why did you leave before his mother could thank you properly?" The question caught her off guard, gentler and more curious than she expected from a man the rumors described as cold. She hesitated, uncertain how to answer even if her voice had allowed her to speak freely. Finally, she reached for the small slate tablet she always carried, and with a slightly unsteady hand, wrote a short reply.
"I did not do it to be thanked."
Cade read the words slowly, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the same flicker of genuine interest she had glimpsed briefly during the sparring trial. "Most candidates in this hold," he said, "would have found a way to make certain I witnessed exactly what they did for that boy." Ren's hand moved again across the slate. "I did not know you were watching." "I know," Cade said quietly. "That is precisely why I am still standing here." He said nothing further, offering no explanation for the comment, no indication of what it might mean for her chances in the selection. He simply held her gaze for one more long moment before continuing down the corridor, leaving Ren standing alone in the flickering torchlight, her heart pounding loud enough that she almost worried he might hear it even from a distance. She did not sleep at all that night. Not from dread this time, but from a confusion so complete she could not begin to untangle it, turning his words over and over in her mind, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the dormitory windows, and the household began to stir once more. The council chamber fell into stunned silence the moment Cade walked through its doors. No one had expected him. In the entire history of the selection, the king had never once attended a private ranking review, trusting his 7 council members to sort thousands of candidates into tiers without his direct involvement. Yet here he was, taking a seat at the head of the long table without a word of explanation, while 7 of the most powerful advisors in the territory exchanged uneasy glances. Edmund, the eldest of the council, and the one most often trusted with final decisions, cleared his throat and began the review, as though nothing unusual were happening at all. "We have narrowed the top tier to 12 candidates," he said, sliding a parchment across the table. "Celine Draven remains our clear frontrunner, followed closely by—" "Read me the full list," Cade interrupted. "Every candidate, every rank." Edmund's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he obeyed, working methodically through tier after tier, dozens of names Cade barely registered as anything more than sounds. It was not until Edmund reached the lowest tier, rushing through the names with obvious disinterest, that Cade finally leaned forward. "Wait," he said. "Read that section again." Edmund blinked. "My lord?" "The Omega candidates. Read them again." Confused, Edmund complied, working through the list of names ranked at the very bottom of the council's assessment, candidates considered so unlikely to advance that most council members had barely bothered to discuss them individually. When he reached the name Ren Calloway, Cade lifted a hand to stop him. Why is she ranked here? Edmund glanced at his fellow council members before answering carefully. She is unable to speak, my lord. She failed to answer the etiquette trial's questions entirely. Her combat performance in the sparring trial ended in a stalemate, rather than a decisive victory. By every standard measure we use. By every standard measure you use, Cade repeated, his tone flat. And what measure accounts for character? For instinct? For how a candidate behaves when she believes no one of importance is watching her at all? The chamber fell silent again. None of the council members had an answer for that, because none of them had ever been asked to consider such a measure before. The selection had always been evaluated through trials of strength, etiquette, and diplomacy, exactly as it had been for generations. Character, in the traditional sense, was assumed to reveal itself naturally through those same trials. My lord, Edmund said carefully, if you have concerns about the Omega's ranking, we can certainly discuss. I want her moved up, Cade said, not to the top tier. I am not asking you to fabricate a result she has not earned through the trials themselves. But I want her included in every remaining stage of this selection, regardless of how the early trials scored her. Do you understand me? The council members exchanged another round of uneasy glances, but none of them dared to argue directly with their king. Edmund finally nodded, making a small notation beside Ren's name. As you wish, my lord. Though I must ask, for the sake of transparency with the other candidates, what reason should we give if questioned? Cade rose from his chair, his expression settling back into the unreadable stillness the entire hold had come to expect from him. You need not give any reason at all, he said. I am the king. My interest requires no justification. He left the chamber without another word, leaving 7 council members to stare at each other in bewildered silence, none of them quite able to explain what had just happened, or what it might mean for the rest of the selection. News of the private ranking review spread through the hold with remarkable speed, as such news always did among a population of thousands confined within the same walls. By the following morning, whispers had already begun circulating that the king himself had intervened in the council's assessment, though no one knew exactly which candidate had benefited from his attention, or why. Ren herself remained entirely unaware of the conversation that had taken place on her behalf. She spent the morning exactly as she had spent every morning since arriving at the hold, rising early, dressing quietly, and making her way to the training courtyard for whatever trial awaited the candidates that day. She had expected, based on her poor performance in the first 2 trials, that she would soon be informed of her dismissal from the selection entirely. Every instinct told her this was simply how her story would end, quietly and without incident, exactly as she had always assumed it would. Instead, when the day's schedule was posted outside the dining hall, her name appeared clearly among the candidates scheduled for the 3rd trial, a diplomatic exercise requiring each candidate to negotiate a hypothetical dispute between 2 rival packs. Ren stared at the posting for a long moment, certain there had been some mistake. She had expected, after her failure in the etiquette trial, to be quietly removed from any exercise requiring verbal communication. Yet here she was, listed alongside candidates far more skilled and far more confident than she could ever hope to be. She considered, briefly, simply not attending. She could claim illness, retreat to the dormitory, and wait quietly for the selection to conclude without her. It would be easier. It would certainly be less humiliating than standing before the council again, forced once more to demonstrate a skill she simply did not possess. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of Cade's quiet questions in the corridor 2 nights earlier, the strange sincerity in his voice, as he asked why she had left before Milo's mother could thank her. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, a refusal to let herself be erased entirely from a story she had never wanted to be part of in the first place, but which she now found herself unwilling to abandon without at least trying. She attended the trial. The diplomatic exercise proved every bit as difficult as she feared. Candidates were paired together and given a hypothetical scenario, a border dispute between 2 allied packs, and asked to negotiate a resolution, while the council observed and evaluated their reasoning, tone, and persuasive skill. Ren's partner, a sharp-tongued beta candidate named Briar, clearly expected to dominate the exercise entirely, given her partner's inability to speak. But Ren had prepared for exactly this possibility. She had spent the previous evening, unable to sleep anyway, writing out a full negotiation strategy on parchment, anticipating every argument Briar might raise, and preparing counterpoints for each one. When the trial began, Wren simply handed her prepared parchment to the council members directly, allowing them to read her full reasoning, while Briar delivered her own arguments aloud. It was an unconventional approach, one the council had clearly never encountered before, and for a long moment, Wren feared it would simply be dismissed as insufficient. But Edmund, reading through her carefully constructed argument, found himself impressed, despite his own expectations. "This is remarkably thorough," he murmured to the council member beside him. "She has considered angles the other candidate has not even mentioned." Briar, sensing the shift in the council's attention, grew visibly flustered, abandoning her rehearsed arguments in favor of increasingly aggressive claims that quickly began to sound less like diplomacy and more like simple bullying. The council noted the shift immediately, and by the end of the exercise, it was clear that Wren's quiet, careful reasoning had outperformed her partner's confident bluster. For the first time since arriving at the hold, Wren left a trial without feeling the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. She did not know, as she walked back toward the dormitory that evening, that Cade had once again been watching from a distance, positioned deliberately at the edge of the courtyard, where his presence would not distract from the trial itself. He had watched her hand her carefully written argument to the council with quiet determination, refusing to let her silence become an excuse for failure. He had watched Briar's composure crumble under the weight of her own arrogance, while Wren's steady, thoughtful reasoning won the council's genuine respect. And he had made a decision, standing there at the edge of the courtyard, that he intended to see through no matter how strongly his council might eventually object to it. That night, he summoned Callan once more. "Arrange a private audience," Cade said, "with the Omega, Wren Calloway. Tomorrow, before the fourth trial begins." Callan hesitated, his loyalty to his king warring visibly with his own confusion. "My lord, a private audience with a candidate this early in the selection is highly unusual. The other candidates will certainly notice, and questions will follow." "Let them ask their questions," Cade said. "I am not required to explain my choices to anyone, least of all a council, more concerned with tradition than with the truth sitting directly in front of them." Callan bowed his head, recognizing the finality in his king's tone. "As you wish, my lord. I will arrange it for tomorrow morning." Cade nodded once, dismissing his second-in-command, and returned to the window of his study, staring out over the darkened courtyard where the trials would resume at first light. Somewhere within the sprawling walls of the hold, thousands of candidates slept, dreaming of crowns and titles, and a future beside the most powerful wolf in the territory. Only one of them, he suspected, had never once dreamed of any such thing at all. And that, more than anything else he had witnessed in 3 days of trials, was exactly why he could not stop thinking about her. Celine Draven heard about the council review the following morning, delivered secondhand through Ottilie, who had gathered the story from a servant girl who cleaned the council chamber. The details were vague, no confirmed name, only a rumor that the king had personally intervened to protect a candidate the council had already dismissed. "It could be anyone," Ottilie said, clearly hoping to reassure her friend, though the worry in her own voice betrayed her. Celine said nothing at first, turning the rumor over in her mind, with the sharp calculation that had carried her to the top of every hierarchy she had ever entered. She had spent years preparing for this selection, training in combat, memorizing pack law, perfecting the graceful confidence that every alpha's daughter was raised to display from birth. She had not spent years preparing to be outmaneuvered by a whispered rumor about an unranked candidate no one could even properly identify. "Find out who it is," she said finally. "How?" Ottilie asked. "I don't care how, just find out." By midday, word had reached Celine, through a different servant entirely, one less discreet than the first, that the candidate in question was an Omega, unable to speak, from a minor pack far to the north. Celine's initial reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by something closer to relief. An Omega, ranked at the very bottom of the council's assessment, hardly seemed like a threat worth taking seriously. Perhaps the king had simply noticed her out of pity, or curiosity, the same way one might notice an unusual bird among a flock of ordinary ones. Still, relief did not entirely erase the small, persistent unease that lingered at the edges of Celine's confidence. She had not survived years of pack politics by ignoring unusual patterns, and a king who had never once involved himself in the council's rankings suddenly breaking that habit, for any candidate, regardless of rank, was undeniably unusual. She decided, for the moment, to watch and wait rather than act. There would be time enough to address the situation properly once she understood exactly what she was dealing with. Ren, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware that she had become the subject of quiet speculation throughout the hold. She spent the evening in the kitchen once more, checking on Milo's healing hand and helping the kitchen staff prepare the following day's meals, grateful for the simple, familiar rhythm of the work after the tension of the diplomatic trial. It was there, elbow deep in bread dough beside an elderly cook named Petra, that a young servant found her with a message. "You are requested," the servant said, glancing nervously between Ren and the small folded parchment in her hand, "for a private audience with the king, tomorrow morning, before the fourth trial begins." Ren's hands stilled in the dough, flour dusting her fingers as she stared at the servant, certain she had misheard, though the girl's expression made clear she had not. Petra, standing nearby, let out a low whistle of surprise. "Well," the old cook said, wiping her own hands on her apron, "seems the king has taken an interest in someone unexpected." Ren took the parchment with trembling hands, reading the formal summons twice before the words fully registered. A private audience, not a trial, not a public exercise where her silence could be excused or accommodated through careful preparation. A private conversation with the most powerful wolf in the territory, where she would have no parchment, no council members reading her prepared arguments aloud, nothing but her own limited voice and whatever wordless methods of communication she could manage. Fear settled over her immediately, cold and sharp, chasing away the small confidence she had built during the diplomatic trial. She spent the rest of the evening in a haze of anxious preparation, gathering her slate tablet, a fresh piece of parchment, and a small charcoal pencil, though she had no idea what questions the king might ask, or what possible answer could satisfy him given her limitations. Sleep, once again, proved impossible. She lay awake through most of the night, staring at the dormitory ceiling, turning over every possible explanation for why a king, who had barely acknowledged her existence during the first two trials, would suddenly request a private audience before the fourth had even begun. She did not, in all her anxious speculation, arrive anywhere close to the actual truth. She could not have imagined that the coldest, most unreadable ruler in the territory had spent the last 3 days quietly unable to stop thinking about her. She could not have imagined that her silence, the very thing she had spent her entire life viewing as a weakness, had become the single most compelling thing about her, in the eyes of a man surrounded, every day of his life, by wolves who never stopped talking. By the time dawn finally broke over the hold, Ren had resigned herself to simply facing whatever the morning brought, exhausted, frightened, and entirely unprepared for the conversation that would change the course of her time at Ashwood Hold forever. The private study smelled of cedar and old parchment, and Ren stood frozen just inside its heavy wooden door, unable to make her legs carry her any further into the room. Cade sat behind a wide desk covered in maps and council reports, though he was not reading any of them when she entered. He had been staring at the door, waiting, and the moment she stepped through it, he rose from his chair, a gesture of respect so unexpected from a king, toward an Omega candidate, that Ren nearly forgot her fear entirely in her confusion. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair, positioned across from his desk. His voice was quieter here than it had been during the trials, stripped of the commanding edge he used before crowds. Ren sat, perching on the edge of the chair as though ready to flee at the first sign of danger, her slate tablet clutched tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Cade studied her with the same intense focus she had noticed during the trials, though without an audience to perform for. The intensity felt different now, less like evaluation, and more like genuine curiosity. "I asked the council to review your ranking," he said finally. "You should know that." Ren's fingers tightened around her slate. She had suspected as much, given the strange summons, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of confusion through her. She reached for her charcoal pencil and wrote a single question on the slate, turning it toward him with a shaking hand. "Why?" Cade read the words slowly, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, from its usual careful neutrality. "Because every other candidate in this selection has spent 3 days trying to convince me they deserve my attention," he said. "And you have spent 3 days trying to avoid it entirely." Ren's face flushed. She erased her question with the edge of her sleeve and wrote another. That is because I do not want to be here. She expected offense, or perhaps disappointment, the kind of reaction that had followed her honesty her entire life. Instead, Cade let out a short, surprised laugh, the sound so unfamiliar coming from him that Wren looked up sharply, certain she had misunderstood something. At least you are honest about it, he said. Do you know how many candidates in that dormitory would sacrifice everything they own for the chance to sit where you are sitting right now? Wren nodded slowly, thinking of Celine Draven and the circle of admiring candidates who followed her every word. And yet you would rather be anywhere else, Cade continued. Why? This question required more explanation than her slate could easily hold, and Wren hesitated, uncertain how much of her story she was willing to share with a man she had known for only 3 days, even if that man happened to be the most powerful wolf in the territory. But something about his stillness, the way he waited without pressing her, without filling the silence the way most people rushed to do around her, made the words feel slightly safer to offer. She began writing, slowly, filling the slate, and then wiping it clean to continue, over several exchanges. She explained, as simply as she could, that her pack alpha had sent her only to fill a quota, that she had no expectation of winning, that omegas rarely advanced far in selections regardless of how the trials went, and that she had spent her entire life learning to be as unnoticed as possible, because attention, for someone like her, usually brought only mockery or pity. Cade read each answer carefully, before responding, never rushing her, never showing the impatience she had expected from someone used to commanding armies and settling disputes between powerful alphas in a matter of minutes. How did you lose your voice? He asked eventually, his tone gentler than any question he had asked so far. Wren's hand stilled over the slate. This was the question she dreaded most, the one that inevitably brought pity, or worse, exaggerated sympathy that felt somehow more humiliating than outright mockery. She considered deflecting, writing something vague and incomplete, the way she usually did with strangers. Instead, for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself, she found herself writing the truth. When I was 6, a rogue wolf attacked our territory. My mother hid me in the storage cellar beneath our cabin. He found me anyway. I do not remember most of what happened. I only remember the pain in my throat afterward, and that I never spoke again the same way. Cade read the words twice, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign of any reaction at all. Your mother, he said quietly. Is she? Wren shook her head before he could finish the question, and wrote a brief answer. She did not survive that night. The room fell silent again, heavier this time, filled with a shared understanding neither of them needed to put into further words. Cade, Wren knew from the rumors that had followed him his entire life, had lost both of his own parents before he was 18, in circumstances the whole staff spoke of only in hushed, careful tones. Whatever had happened to his family, it seemed to have left a mark similar in shape to the one carved into her own life, even if the details differed. I did not tell you that to receive your pity, Wren wrote finally, when the silence stretched long enough to feel unbearable. I know, Cade said. I did not offer any. And strangely, looking at his face, she believed him completely. There was no softness in his expression that resembled pity, no careful gentleness meant to comfort a wounded creature. There was only a quiet, steady attention that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen rather than simply observed. Most people, Cade said after a moment, either look away from what happened to you, or they cannot stop staring at it. You have decided instead to build an entire life around making certain no one asks. Wren's hand trembled slightly as she wrote her response. It is easier that way. Easier, Cade repeated, is not the same as better. The words struck something deep in her chest, an uncomfortable truth she had spent years avoiding. By staying small, staying quiet, staying carefully out of sight of anyone who might expect more from her than survival. She had no response prepared for that particular observation, and simply sat in silence, allowing his words to settle over her, without argument. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, moving through smaller, less painful topics, as the tension in the room gradually eased. Cade asked about her pack's territory, and Wren described the stream behind her cabin, the quiet mornings she used to spend walking alone before the rest of the pack woke. He asked what she enjoyed doing when she was not attending to pack duties, and she wrote, somewhat shyly, that she liked to cook, that she found comfort in kitchens the way other people found comfort in music or poetry. Cade, in turn, offered small pieces of himself that Wren suspected he rarely shared with anyone, given the careful, guarded way he spoke even about simple things. He mentioned, briefly, that he had inherited the crown far younger than he expected, that the weight of ruling had left him little time or patience for the kind of performative devotion most of the selection's candidates seemed determined to offer him. "They all want to be queen," he said at one point, his voice carrying a faint trace of exhaustion Wren had not expected to hear from someone so universally feared and respected. "Almost none of them want to know me." Wren considered this for a long moment before writing her response. "Perhaps that is because you have made it very difficult for anyone to know you." Cade's eyes lifted to hers sharply at that, and for a moment, Wren feared she had overstepped, said something too honest, too bold for an Omega candidate to say to her king. But instead of anger, she found something closer to reluctant amusement in his expression. "You may be the first person in this entire selection brave enough to say that to my face," he said. Wren allowed herself, for the first time since entering his study, a small, genuine smile. She wrote one final line before the audience concluded. "I did not say it. I wrote it. My voice would never have managed such courage." Cade laughed again, the sound warmer this time, less startled than the first, and something in Wren's chest loosened just slightly, a small, unfamiliar sense of ease settling over the fear that had gripped her since receiving the summons. When the audience finally ended, Cade rose and walked her to the door himself, an unusual courtesy that did not go unnoticed by the guards stationed outside, whose expressions betrayed a curiosity they were far too disciplined to voice aloud. "The fourth trial begins within the hour," Cade said, as she stepped past him into the corridor. "I expect you will find a way to surprise the council again." Wren glanced back at him, uncertain what to make of the strange warmth in his voice, and simply nodded, before continuing down the corridor toward the courtyard, her heart pounding with an entirely different kind of nervousness than the one that had carried her into his study an hour earlier. She did not yet understand the full weight of what had just happened between them. She did not yet understand that word of her private audience had already begun spreading through the dormitory hall, carried by servants and guards who had witnessed her summons and her unusually long absence from the morning's preparations. She did not yet understand that Celine Draven, informed of the audience within minutes by one of her many well-placed sources, had just decided that the silent Omega everyone had dismissed as harmless was, in fact, the single greatest threat to everything Celine had spent her entire life working toward. Celine received the news while having her hair braided by Ottilie, and her hands went still in her lap the moment the words left her friend's mouth. "An hour," Ottilie repeated, watching her friend's expression carefully. "A full hour, alone in his private study. No council members present. No other candidates. That is not how the selection works," Celine said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Private audiences are meant to come later, after the trials have narrowed the field. He has never granted one this early, to anyone, in any selection before this one." "Maybe it means nothing," Ottilie offered, though her tone lacked real conviction. "Maybe he simply wanted to understand why she cannot speak. Kings are curious about unusual things." Celine said nothing for a long moment, staring at her own reflection in the small mirror propped against the dormitory wall. She thought of the girl she had dismissed so easily days earlier, the mute Omega with the scarred throat and the downcast eyes, and felt, for the first time since arriving at the hold, a genuine flicker of uncertainty about her own position. She had built her entire life around being the obvious choice, the strongest fighter among the alpha candidates, the most polished speaker during the etiquette trials, the daughter of a powerful ally whose support the king could not easily afford to overlook. Every advantage she possessed had been carefully built and maintained since childhood, and she had never once imagined losing to a candidate the council itself had ranked at the very bottom of the field. "Find out everything you can about her," Celine said finally, her voice cold and decisive. "Where she comes from, what her pack thinks of her, anything that might explain why he would waste an hour of his time on someone so far beneath his notice." "And if there is nothing to find?" Ottilie asked carefully. Celine's eyes met her friend's in the mirror, sharp and calculating. "Then we will simply have to make certain there is something worth finding." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with an implication Ottilie did not fully understand yet, though she recognized well enough the tone her friend used whenever she had decided a particular obstacle needed removing, rather than simply outmaneuvering. She nodded once, agreeing to help without asking further questions, the way she always did when Celine's ambition demanded loyalty above curiosity. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, that their conversation had been overheard by a young servant girl, passing quietly through the dormitory hall, gathering laundry for the evening wash. The girl said nothing, continuing her work exactly as she had before, though she would remember, days later, exactly what she had heard, and exactly who had said it. For now, the hold settled into its evening rhythms exactly as it had every night since the selection began, thousands of candidates preparing for another day of trials, unaware of the quiet storm gathering just beneath the surface of the courtyard's carefully managed order. Ren returned to her cot that night, still turning over every word of her conversation with Cade, unaware entirely of the conversation happening at the same moment only a few beds away, a conversation that would soon reach far beyond simple dormitory gossip and into something considerably more dangerous. The fourth trial nearly ended in disaster before it even began, when Ren discovered her uniform had been cut along every seam sometime during the night. She stared at the ruined fabric for a long, silent moment, her fingers tracing the clean, deliberate slices that ran along the sleeves and hem, far too precise to be simple wear or accident. Someone had done this on purpose, sometime between the previous evening and this morning, while she slept only a few feet away, unaware. Fear crept up her spine, cold and sharp. She had no allies in this dormitory, no one who might have witnessed the sabotage or could vouch for her innocence should anyone accuse her of destroying hold property herself. She gathered the ruined uniform quickly, stuffing it beneath her cot, and dressed instead in the spare set every candidate had been issued, praying no one would notice the substitution or ask questions she had no easy way to answer. She made it through the morning inspection without incident, though her hands trembled the entire time, and she spent the walk to the courtyard glancing nervously at the other candidates, searching their faces for any hint of satisfaction or guilt that might reveal who among them had done this. No one's expression gave anything away. Celine, in particular, walked past her with the same practiced indifference she always displayed, offering no glance, no smirk, nothing that might confirm Ren's growing suspicion. The fourth trial itself proved to be a test of pack loyalty and problem-solving. Candidates divided into small groups and given a hypothetical crisis to resolve together, a food shortage threatening a fictional pack's youngest and most vulnerable members. Ren found herself grouped with 3 other candidates, none of whom she recognized, and braced herself for another round of dismissive glances the moment they realized her limitations. Instead, to her surprise, one of her group members, a quiet beta candidate named Isla, simply handed her a spare piece of parchment without being asked, gesturing for Ren to write down her ideas alongside the group's discussion. It was a small kindness, unremarkable to anyone else watching, but it settled something anxious in Ren's chest that had been coiled tight since discovering her ruined uniform that morning. The group worked through the crisis methodically, and Ren, freed from the fear of being dismissed outright, contributed several ideas that the others readily incorporated into their final proposal, including a suggestion to redistribute the shortage across multiple smaller storage sites, rather than risking everything in a single location, an idea drawn directly from practical experience, helping manage her own pack's winter stores. The council seemed genuinely impressed by the group's final presentation, and for the second trial in a row, Ren left the courtyard without the familiar weight of humiliation pressing down on her chest. But the relief did not last long. That evening, as candidates gathered for the communal meal, a rumor began circulating through the dining hall with startling speed, whispered from table to table until it reached every corner of the room within the span of a single hour. The story, as it eventually reached Ren's own ears through a nervous, apologetic Isla, claimed that Ren had been caught the previous week stealing from her own pack's stores before being sent to the selection, and that her alpha had only agreed to submit her as a candidate to be rid of a dishonest, unreliable Omega, rather than to fulfill any genuine quota obligation. The accusation was entirely false, a cruel fabrication with no basis in truth whatsoever, but false accusations, Ren had learned long ago, rarely required truth to do damage. She watched, from her quiet corner of the dining hall, as candidates who had never spoken to her directly began glancing her way with new suspicion, their whispered conversations pausing whenever she passed too close, their expressions shifting from simple indifference to something closer to distrust. She had no way to defend herself against a rumor that spread mouth to mouth faster than she could ever hope to counter with her slate tablet and careful, slow-written explanations. By the time she finished her meal and returned to the dormitory, the damage had already been done, the story repeated so many times, and with such convincing detail, that even candidates who had shown her small kindnesses earlier now regarded her with new wariness. Isla found her later that night, sitting alone on her cot, staring blankly at the wall. "It isn't true, is it?" Isla asked quietly, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Ren shook her head firmly, reaching for her slate. "I have never stolen anything in my life. My alpha sent me only to fill the quota, exactly as he did for every candidate our pack owed." Isla read the words slowly, her expression softening with something like guilt. "I believe you," she said, "but not everyone will. Celine has been telling anyone who will listen that she heard the story directly from someone in your home pack." Ren's chest tightened at the mention of Celine's name, confirming a suspicion she had not wanted to fully acknowledge until now. It made a certain grim sense, she realized. Celine had motive, having learned of the private audience with Cade, and Celine certainly had the resources and influence to spread a fabricated story quickly and convincingly throughout the entire dormitory. But suspicion, without proof, offered no path toward defending herself, and Ren spent another sleepless night, turning over every possible way to counter a lie that had already spread far beyond her ability to contain it. The following morning brought a second, more direct incident. Ren arrived at the courtyard for the 5th trial to find her assigned training partner, a nervous young Omega named Cressida, refusing to make eye contact with her at all, whispering instead to the candidates on either side of her whenever Ren drew near. "I heard she attacked another Omega back home," Cressida murmured, just loud enough for Ren to hear clearly, though not loud enough to be considered an open confrontation the trial masters might intervene in. That is the real reason her alpha wanted her gone. The lie had grown even further overnight, mutating from simple theft into something closer to outright violence. Exactly the kind of escalation Ren had feared once a fabrication took root among thousands of candidates, eager for gossip and drama, to fill the long, tense days of the selection. She wanted, desperately, to defend herself, to somehow make these strangers understand the truth of her quiet, careful life, the years spent making herself small and unremarkable, specifically to avoid ever being the subject of exactly this kind of cruel attention. But every attempt to write an explanation felt inadequate against a story that had already captured the dormitory's imagination so thoroughly. She endured the 5th trial in near total isolation, her training partner refusing to cooperate with her at all, forcing Ren to complete most of the exercise alone, while Cressida offered only minimal, grudging assistance whenever the trial masters were directly watching. By the trial's end, Ren's performance had suffered noticeably, her results falling well below what she had managed in the previous 2 trials, and she caught more than one council member making a note beside her name with an expression of renewed skepticism. She left the courtyard that evening feeling more isolated than she had at any point since arriving at the hold, the small progress she had made over the past several days, seemingly undone entirely by a rumor she had no power to disprove. It was Milo, of all people, who finally gave her the first hint of hope. She found him in the kitchen that evening, his bandaged hand nearly healed, practicing the hand signs she had taught him a few days earlier, with the careful concentration only children seemed to possess. He looked up when she entered, and instead of the usual bright smile he greeted her with, his small face was troubled. "The big girl with the dark hair," he said carefully, using the awkward, halting signs she had taught him, alongside his own hesitant words. "She was talking to Petra's helper yesterday. She gave her money to say things about you." Ren went very still, kneeling beside him immediately, her full attention focused on his small, earnest face. She reached for her slate and wrote quickly. "What did you hear exactly?" Milo frowned, concentrating hard on remembering the details. She said, "Tell everyone the Omega girl is a thief. Say you heard it from her pack." She gave her 3 silver coins. Ren's hands trembled slightly as she processed what he was telling her. A child's testimony, however sincere, would carry little weight against a powerful alpha's daughter, and Ren had no illusions about how such an accusation would be received if she tried to bring it before the council directly. But it was something, a thread of truth she could hold on to, even if she could not yet use it to unravel the lie Celine had so carefully constructed. She hugged Milo gently, careful of his healing hand, and wrote one final message on her slate before leaving the kitchen that night. "Thank you. Please do not repeat this to anyone else yet. It could put you in danger." Milo nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of secrecy even at his young age, and Ren left the kitchen with the first genuine plan forming in her mind since the rumors had begun. She did not yet know how she would use what Milo had told her, or whether it would matter at all against Celine's carefully cultivated influence throughout the hold. But for the first time since the sabotage of her uniform 2 days earlier, she no longer felt entirely powerless against the storm gathering around her. Cade heard the rumors himself 2 days later, though not through any of the usual channels of hold gossip that reached his study eventually, regardless of how carefully he tried to remain above such matters. He heard it directly from Callan, whose expression that morning carried none of its usual composure. "There is a story circulating among the candidates," Callan said carefully, closing the study door behind him before continuing. "About the Omega you requested a private audience with." Cade set down the report he had been reading, giving his second-in-command his full attention. "Tell me." Callan relayed the rumor exactly as it had reached him: the theft, the alleged violence against another Omega, the claim that her own Alpha had sent her away in disgrace rather than through any genuine quota obligation. Cade listened without interrupting, his expression darkening steadily with each new detail. "Is there any truth to it?" Callan asked once he finished. "None," Cade said flatly. "I have spoken with her directly. Her Alpha sent her exactly as every pack sends their required candidates. There has been no theft, no violence, nothing resembling what is being described." "Then someone is spreading a deliberate falsehood," Callan said. "Yes," Cade said, his voice quiet and controlled, in a way that Callan recognized as far more dangerous than open anger. "And I intend to find out exactly who." He did not act immediately, understanding that a king intervening too visibly on behalf of a single candidate risked drawing exactly the kind of attention that could make her situation worse, rather than better, among a dormitory already inclined toward suspicion and jealousy. Instead, he asked Callan to quietly investigate the origin of the rumor, tracing it back through the same servant networks that had first carried the story from bed to bed and table to table. It took 3 more days for Callan to return with an answer, though the answer, once confirmed, came as no great surprise to either of them. A kitchen helper, bribed with a handful of silver coins, had first spread the story at Celine Draven's direct request, embellishing the details further with each retelling exactly as Celine had apparently instructed. "She has covered her tracks reasonably well," Callan admitted. "The kitchen helper will not testify openly against an Alpha's daughter with the influence Celine commands, but the pattern is clear enough, my lord, even without a formal confession." Cade absorbed this information in silence, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. He had known, from the moment he chose to grant Ren a private audience, that such an unusual gesture would provoke exactly this kind of jealous response from candidates who viewed the selection as a competition to be won through any means necessary. He had simply underestimated how quickly, and how viciously, that response would materialize. "Continue watching her," he said finally. "Celine, I mean. If she has done this once, she will likely try again, especially now that her first attempt has succeeded in damaging the Omega's standing among the other candidates." "And Ren Calloway?" Callan asked. "Should I inform her that the rumor has been traced back to its source?" Cade considered this for a long moment. "No," he said eventually. "Not yet. Let her continue believing she must navigate this alone for now. I want to see how she handles adversity without my direct intervention, before I decide how visibly I am willing to defend her." It was, Callan privately thought, a somewhat cold calculation for a king who had clearly developed a genuine, unusual interest in this particular candidate. But he said nothing, recognizing that his king's careful caution likely stemmed as much from concern for Ren's own standing among the other candidates as from any strategic consideration. A king seen defending a single Omega too openly, too early, risked making her situation among her fellow candidates considerably worse rather than better, regardless of his own genuine intentions. Ren, unaware of any of this quiet investigation happening on her behalf, spent the following days navigating an increasingly hostile dormitory with the same quiet resilience she had relied upon her entire life. She did not confront Celine directly, understanding the futility of accusing an alpha's daughter of wrongdoing without solid proof the council would accept. Instead, she focused simply on surviving each trial as it came, gathering what small allies she could find among candidates like Isla, who had shown her genuine kindness, and holding on to Milo's testimony as a quiet, private comfort, even if she could not yet use it openly. She did not know that her silent endurance was being carefully observed from a distance by the one person in the entire hold whose opinion mattered more than she yet understood. And she certainly did not know that the true confrontation between herself and Celine Draven, one that would finally expose the truth before the entire assembled hold, was still several trials away, gathering force exactly like the quiet storm it had always been destined to become. The formal gala announcement arrived exactly 1 week into the selection, and the entire hold erupted into a frenzy of preparation the moment the notice was posted. Every candidate remaining in the competition would attend a grand evening event, hosted personally by the king, where the council would formally announce the candidates advancing to the selection's final stage. It was, by every account Ren had heard whispered throughout the dormitory, the single most important night of the entire process, a chance for the surviving candidates to present themselves before Cade and the assembled alphas of every allied pack in a setting far more intimate and consequential than the training courtyard. Ren had little interest in the gala itself, though she understood well enough that attendance was mandatory, and that her performance that evening, however small a role she expected to play among candidates far more polished than herself, would likely factor into whatever final decisions the council made about her continued place in the selection. She spent the days leading up to the event exactly as she had spent every day since the rumors began, quietly enduring the suspicious glances and whispered comments that still followed her through the courtyard, though the intensity had faded somewhat as newer gossip inevitably captured the dormitory's attention. Isla remained a steady, quiet ally, and Milo continued greeting her with genuine warmth whenever she visited the kitchen, small comforts that made the isolation more bearable, even if they could not erase it entirely. Celine, meanwhile, had grown increasingly confident as the gala approached, her earlier uncertainty about Ren's private audience with Cade replaced by a renewed sense of her own inevitable victory. The rumor she had planted continued to work in her favor, keeping the Omega candidate isolated and distrusted among her peers, and Celine had heard nothing further to suggest that Cade's interest in Ren extended beyond simple curiosity that would surely fade as the selection progressed toward its more serious final stages. But Celine was not a woman content to rely on a single strategy, however successful it had proven so far. 2 days before the gala, she gathered Ottilie and 2 other trusted candidates in a quiet corner of the dormitory, away from the prying ears that had betrayed her plans once already. The gala will be the last real chance for anyone to catch the king's attention before the final tier is announced, Celine said, her voice low and calculating. I intend to make certain that whatever attention the Omega has managed to attract so far ends decisively that night, in front of everyone who matters. What did you have in mind? Ottilie asked. Celine's smile carried none of the warmth she displayed so easily in public settings. Something public. Something that will make her humiliation impossible to ignore or forget, in front of every alpha and council member who will be watching that evening. The plan she outlined over the following minutes was cruel in its precision, designed specifically to exploit Ren's greatest vulnerability in front of the largest possible audience. Celine intended to arrange for Ren to be called upon publicly during the gala's formal toast, a tradition in which each of the top remaining candidates was expected to offer a brief, gracious statement, honoring the king before the assembled alphas. An Omega candidate, ranked far below the tier typically included in such toasts, would ordinarily never be called upon for such an honor. But Celine, through careful manipulation of one of the gala's junior organizers, a nervous young beta eager to please an alpha's daughter with such obvious influence, had arranged exactly that. Ren's name would be included on the list of candidates expected to speak, an impossible task for someone unable to produce more than a broken rasp, guaranteed to result in a public spectacle of humiliation before the very audience whose opinion mattered most. She will stand there, Celine said, satisfaction evident in every word, unable to say a single word, in front of every alpha in this territory, and everyone will finally understand exactly how unsuitable she truly is. Ottilie hesitated slightly at the cruelty of the plan, though her loyalty to Celine ultimately outweighed whatever small discomfort she felt. And if the king intervenes on her behalf, He won't, Celine said, with a confidence that masked the small uncertainty she still carried since first hearing of Ren's private audience. A king does not publicly rescue an unranked Omega candidate in front of every allied alpha in his territory. Whatever passing curiosity he felt toward her will not survive witnessing her fail so completely, so publicly. The plan set into motion that same afternoon, the junior organizer quietly adding Ren's name to the formal speaking list, careful to bury it among dozens of other names so that no one reviewing the schedule beforehand would think to question it. Ren herself remained entirely unaware, occupied instead with the far more mundane task of preparing whatever simple gown had been issued to her for the evening's formal dress code. It was Isla, checking the posted schedule the evening before the gala out of simple curiosity, who first noticed Ren's name listed among the candidates expected to speak. "Ren," she said, finding her friend in the dormitory that evening, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately caught Ren's attention. "Come look at this." Ren followed her to the notice board posted near the dining hall entrance, and her stomach dropped the moment she saw her own name listed clearly among the candidates scheduled to offer a formal toast during tomorrow's gala. She stared at the posting for a long moment, disbelief and dawning panic warring within her. This had to be a mistake. Omega candidates ranked as low as herself were never included in such formal proceedings, reserved traditionally for the top tier of contenders the council considered genuine prospects for the Luna position. There was no logical reason her name should appear here at all, unless someone had deliberately placed it there. "Do you think it's a mistake?" Isla asked, though her tone suggested she suspected otherwise. Ren shook her head slowly, already piecing together the likely explanation with a sinking certainty that settled cold and heavy in her chest. She thought of Celine's calculated indifference toward her in the courtyard each morning, the careful way the Alpha's daughter had never once directly acknowledged the rumors she had almost certainly orchestrated. This felt exactly like the kind of precise, cruel strategy Celine would employ, a public setup designed to accomplish what whispered rumors alone had not yet fully achieved. "I cannot speak," Ren wrote on her slate, her hand trembling slightly with the beginning of real panic. "If I am called forward and cannot offer a toast, it will look exactly as they want it to look." "Can you request to be removed from the list?" Isla asked. Ren considered this, but shook her head again. Requesting removal would only draw further attention to her limitation, and worse, would likely be denied outright given how close to the gala itself the request would come. There was no clean escape from what had clearly been designed as an inescapable trap. She spent that final night before the gala in a state of quiet, controlled panic, turning over every possible response to a situation, with no obvious solution. She considered simply refusing to attend entirely, accepting whatever punishment came from missing a mandatory event, rather than facing public humiliation before every alpha in the territory. She considered attempting to write out her toast in advance and having someone read it aloud on her behalf, though she had no idea whether such an accommodation would even be permitted during so formal an occasion. In the end, exhausted and out of better options, she resolved simply to attend, to face whatever moment came when her name was called, and to survive it, as best she could, exactly as she had survived every other humiliation life had ever handed her. It would not be pleasant. It would likely be the worst moment of an already difficult selection. But she had endured worse than public embarrassment before, and she told herself, lying awake through most of that final restless night, that she would endure this too. She did not yet know that Cade himself had been informed of the speaking list only hours earlier, during a routine review of the gala's proceedings with his council. She did not know that upon seeing an unranked Omega candidate's name included among the formal toasts, an event traditionally reserved for the top tier alone, Cade had gone very still, his suspicion immediately landing on exactly the same explanation Ren herself had already reached. And she certainly did not know that the White Lycan King, rather than allowing the situation to unfold exactly as Celine had planned, had already begun quietly preparing his own response to whatever cruelty awaited Ren at tomorrow's gala, a response that would ultimately reveal far more about his true feelings than either of them had yet been willing to admit aloud. Cade summoned Edmund to his study within the hour, the older council member arriving slightly out of breath, clearly unsettled by the urgency of the summons so late in the evening. "Explain to me," Cade said, sliding the speaking list across his desk, "how an Omega candidate ranked outside the top tier came to be included in tomorrow's formal toasts." Edmund studied the list carefully, his brow furrowing as he searched for the name Cade had circled. "My lord, this is highly irregular. The speaking list is meant to include only the top 20 candidates, exactly as it has for every selection in living memory. I did not approve this addition myself." "Then find out who did," Cade said. Edmund left immediately, and returned within the hour, with an answer that confirmed everything Cade had already suspected. The junior organizer responsible for finalizing the speaking list, when questioned directly, admitted with visible fear that she had added the name at the request of a senior candidate, though she refused, out of evident terror, to name the candidate responsible. "She fears retaliation," Edmund explained, "from whoever asked her to make the change." "I do not need her to name anyone," Cade said. "I already know." He spent a long while after Edmund's departure standing at the window of his study, staring out over the darkened courtyard, considering his options carefully. He could simply remove Wren's name from the list entirely, sparing her the humiliation Celine had so carefully arranged. It would be the simplest solution, quiet and effective, requiring no public confrontation at all. But something about that solution felt incomplete to him, a quiet correction that would leave Celine's cruelty entirely unaddressed and unpunished, free to attempt some new scheme the moment this one failed to achieve its purpose. And more than that, some instinct he could not fully articulate told him that Wren deserved more than a quiet rescue, conducted entirely behind her back, without her knowledge or consent. He thought of their conversation in his study days earlier, her insistence that she had not shared her painful history seeking his pity, her quiet observation that he had made himself difficult for anyone to truly know. He did not want to become, in this moment, exactly the kind of protector who acted without regard for her own agency, solving her problems invisibly, while she remained unaware of the danger she had narrowly avoided. He made his decision slowly, turning it over from every angle, before finally settling on a course of action that felt right. He would not remove her name from the list. He would allow the gala to proceed exactly as scheduled, and he would trust her, as he had begun to trust her judgment and character over the past week, to face whatever moment awaited her with the same quiet resilience she had shown throughout every trial so far. But he would not leave her to face that moment entirely alone. He summoned Callan one final time that night, and gave him a set of instructions that left his second-in-command studying him with open curiosity, though he asked no questions, understanding well enough by now that his king's interest in the silent Omega had grown into something far more significant than simple curiosity. Tomorrow's gala, Cade suspected, would prove to be a turning point far more consequential than Celine Draven could possibly anticipate, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself genuinely looking forward to seeing exactly how the evening would unfold. Wren, unaware entirely of the quiet decisions being made on her behalf within the king's private study, spent her final hours before the gala helping Petra in the kitchen one last time, finding a strange comfort in the familiar chopping and stirring that had nothing to do with speeches or alphas or the terrifying prospect of standing silent before thousands of watching eyes. Milo sat nearby, practicing his hand signs, oblivious to the tension coiled tightly beneath his friend's careful composure. "Will you be at the gala tomorrow?" he asked, his small hands forming the question as best he could remember it. Wren nodded, forcing a small smile she did not entirely feel. "Will you dance?" Milo asked, clearly more interested in the festive aspects of the evening than any of its political weight. Wren shook her head, gesturing instead toward her own throat, a gentle reminder of the limitation that colored every part of her experience at the hold. Milo's face fell slightly, sympathy replacing curiosity, and he reached out to pat her hand with the earnest comfort only a child could offer so simply. "You don't need to talk to be nice," he said, his logic uncomplicated and entirely sincere. "You're already the nicest one here." Wren's throat tightened with an emotion far different from her usual anxiety, and she pulled him into a gentle hug, grateful beyond words for the simple, unguarded kindness of a child too young to understand pack politics, or selection rankings, or the cruel machinations of Alphaz's daughters, determined to protect their own ambitions at any cost. She left the kitchen that night, carrying his words with her like a small, warm ember against the cold dread of tomorrow's gala, uncertain what the evening would bring, but somehow, for reasons she could not fully explain, slightly less afraid than she had been only a few hours earlier. The great hall blazed with candlelight, and Wren's hands would not stop shaking. She stood near the back of the assembled candidates, dressed in the simple gray gown issued to every Omega for the occasion, watching as alphas from every allied pack in the territory filled the hall with their booming laughter and elaborate formal attire. Long tables lined the walls, heavy with food and wine, and musicians played somewhere near the front of the room, though the melody barely registered through the roaring anxiety filling Ren's ears. She had rehearsed, over and over through the sleepless night before, exactly how she would handle the moment her name was called. She would step forward, she would offer a small, respectful bow, she would gesture toward her throat, the universal sign she had used her entire life to explain her silence, and she would step back, allowing the moment to pass as quickly and quietly as possible. It would not stop the humiliation entirely, but it was the only plan available to her, and she clung to it now as the formal toasts began, candidate after candidate stepping forward to offer their carefully rehearsed words of devotion and respect toward the king seated at the head of the hall. Celine, predictably, delivered her toast with flawless confidence, her voice carrying easily across the vast chamber, praising Cade's strength and wisdom in language so polished it could have been carved from marble. The assembled alphas nodded approvingly, and Cade himself offered a small, formal nod of acknowledgement, though Ren noticed, even from her distant position near the back of the hall, that his expression remained as carefully unreadable as ever. Candidate after candidate followed, the toasts blending together into an increasingly indistinguishable stream of praise and ambition, until finally, the junior organizer responsible for the evening's proceedings called out a name that sent Ren's stomach plummeting toward the floor. Ren Calloway. The hall did not fall silent immediately. Most of the assembled alphas, unfamiliar with the lower-ranked candidates, simply continued their conversations, mildly curious about an unfamiliar name. But among the candidates themselves, and particularly among those who had spent the past week whispering rumors about the mute Omega from a minor northern pack, the silence spread quickly, curious eyes turning toward the back of the hall where Ren stood frozen. She forced her legs to move, walking the long distance toward the front of the hall with every eye now fixed upon her, the weight of thousands of gazes pressing down on her like a physical force. She caught Celine's expression as she passed, a carefully controlled mask of polite interest that did nothing to hide the satisfaction gleaming just beneath the surface. Ren reached the front of the hall and turned to face the assembled crowd, her heart hammering so violently she feared everyone in the room could surely hear it. She opened her mouth, exactly as she had rehearsed, prepared to offer her small bow and the familiar gesture toward her throat that would explain her silence to the confused waiting crowd. A faint, broken rasp emerged instead of words, exactly as it always did, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the hall, confusion shifting quickly toward something closer to open mockery among several of the younger candidates near the front. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the tense silence like a blade, and Ren felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble entirely. This was exactly the moment Celine had designed. This was exactly the humiliation she had orchestrated, precise and inescapable, unfolding now in front of every alpha and council member whose opinion would shape the rest of the selection. Ren's eyes stung with the effort of holding back tears, and she began, with trembling hands, to gesture toward her throat, the small explanation she had prepared, though the mocking laughter had already grown loud enough that she doubted anyone would even bother watching closely enough to understand it. And then, before the laughter could grow any further, a chair scraped loudly against the stone floor at the head of the hall. Cade rose from his seat. The hall fell instantly, completely silent, every eye shifting from Ren toward the king himself as he stepped down from the raised dais and walked, unhurried, toward the front of the assembled crowd, where Ren stood frozen, humiliation still burning bright across her face. He did not stop beside her the way the crowd seemed to expect, offering some quiet, private word of comfort meant only for her ears. Instead, he turned to face the entire hall directly, his voice carrying with the same effortless authority that had silenced 10,000 frightened candidates on the very first night of the selection. "This candidate," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast chamber, lost her voice as a child, defending her own life against a rogue wolf who took everything else from her that night, including her mother. The hall remained utterly silent, every alpha and candidate present hanging on his every word. "She has spent this entire selection navigating trials designed for candidates who can speak freely, and she has done so with more integrity, more genuine character, and more quiet courage than I have witnessed from candidates twice her rank throughout this entire process. His eyes swept the crowd slowly, deliberately, before continuing. I have personally reviewed the circumstances surrounding tonight's speaking list, and I know precisely how her name came to be included among candidates it was never meant to include. A visible ripple of unease passed through the crowd, and Ren, still standing frozen beside him, watched as several candidates near the front, Celine included, went suddenly, carefully still, their earlier amusement draining rapidly from their expressions. I will not name the candidate responsible tonight, Cade continued, his voice cooling several degrees further, though I suspect she understands perfectly well that I know exactly who she is. I will say only this. This selection was designed to find a Luna worthy of standing beside her king and her people. It was never designed to reward cruelty toward those with less power to defend themselves. He turned then, finally, to face Ren directly, his expression softening slightly from the cold authority he had just directed at the assembled crowd. You do not owe this hall a toast, he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for those close enough to hear clearly. You have already shown more of your character in silence than most of these candidates have managed with a lifetime of careful words. Ren stared up at him, tears finally spilling freely down her face, though these tears carried none of the humiliation she had braced herself for only moments earlier. She managed, somehow, a small, unsteady nod, unable to trust her own composure enough to attempt any further response. Cade extended his arm toward her, an unmistakable gesture of protection and respect that every alpha in the hall immediately understood the significance of. Ren hesitated only a moment before accepting it, allowing him to walk her back toward the edge of the hall himself, away from the crowd's continued stunned silence, before quietly instructing a nearby servant to see her safely return to the dormitory for the remainder of the evening. The gala continued after that, though the atmosphere had shifted entirely, the earlier festive energy replaced by a cautious, watchful tension that lingered through the remainder of the formal toasts. Celine completed the evening with her usual composed grace, though those seated close enough noticed the tight, controlled anger simmering just beneath her carefully maintained mask. Ren, meanwhile, lay awake in the dormitory long after the gala concluded, replaying the moment Cade had risen from his seat, over and over, still hardly able to believe what had happened. He had known. He had known about her past, about the rumors, about the trap Celine had so carefully constructed, and rather than allowing her to face it entirely alone, he had chosen, in front of every powerful alpha in the territory, to defend her openly. She did not yet fully understand what this meant, for her standing in the selection, or for whatever strange, unfamiliar feeling had begun growing steadily in her chest since the moment she first sat across from him in his private study. But she understood, with absolute clarity now, that the White Lycan King's interest in her was no longer something she could dismiss as simple curiosity, or explain away as pity for an unfortunate Omega with a tragic past. It was something far more significant than that. And come morning, she suspected, she would finally have to confront exactly what that meant, both for herself and for the increasingly precarious position she now found herself occupying, within a selection that suddenly felt far more dangerous than it had only a week earlier. Celine did not sleep at all that night either, though her sleeplessness carried none of the confused, tender uncertainty occupying Ren's thoughts. She lay awake in the dormitory consumed entirely by rage, replaying Cade's words over and over in her mind, the unmistakable weight of his warning, aimed directly at her, even without naming her openly before the assembled hall. He knew, somehow, despite her careful precautions, despite the bribed kitchen helper and the frightened junior organizer who had added Ren's name to the speaking list at her request, Cade had traced the entire scheme back to its source with unnerving precision, and rather than confronting her privately, quietly, in a manner that might have allowed her to salvage some portion of her dignity and standing, he had chosen instead to deliver his warning in the most public setting possible, in front of every alpha whose good opinion she desperately needed to maintain. He humiliated you, Attili whispered from the neighboring cot, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine sympathy beneath her usual eager loyalty. In front of everyone. He humiliated no one, Celine said coldly, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. He made a scene over an Omega who cannot even properly thank him for his attention. But privately, alone with her own thoughts long after Attili's breathing had evened into sleep, Celine understood with growing unease exactly how serious a mistake she had made. She had believed, with the arrogant confidence that had carried her through every challenge she had ever faced, that a king would never risk his standing among allied alphas to publicly defend an unranked Omega candidate. She had been catastrophically wrong, and the miscalculation had cost her something she was only beginning to understand the full weight of: the king's trust, and quite possibly, his consideration for her as a genuine candidate for Luna at all. She thought, with bitter clarity, of the years she had spent preparing for this exact selection, the countless hours of combat training, diplomatic study, and careful cultivation of the perfect image expected of a future Luna. All of it, she feared now, might have been undone in a single evening by her own miscalculated cruelty toward a candidate she had dismissed too easily as harmless. She resolved, lying awake through the remaining hours before dawn, that she would need to be considerably more careful going forward. Whatever scheme she attempted next against Wren Calloway would need to be far more subtle, far less traceable back to her own involvement, if she hoped to avoid further damaging her own standing in front of the very king she still intended to win, regardless of the setback tonight's gala had dealt her. Elsewhere in the hold, the story of the gala spread with the same rapid speed that had once carried Celine's fabricated rumors through the dormitory, though this time, the story worked entirely in Wren's favor. By morning, candidates who had barely acknowledged her existence a week earlier now regarded her with open curiosity, some with genuine sympathy for the tragic history Cade had revealed, others with the same calculating suspicion Celine herself had first felt upon learning of the private audience. Isla found Wren early the next morning, before the dormitory had fully woken, sitting quietly on her cot staring at nothing in particular. "Everyone is talking about last night," Isla said gently, settling onto the edge of the neighboring cot. "About what he said." Wren reached for her slate, her hand steadier than it had been in days. "I did not expect that." "None of us did," Isla admitted. "I don't think anyone in this entire hold has ever seen the king intervene so directly on behalf of any candidate before, let alone one from the lowest tier." Wren considered this for a long moment before writing her next thought. "I am not certain what it means for the rest of the selection." Isla studied her friend carefully, an unusual seriousness settling over her normally cheerful expression. "I think it means considerably more than you're willing to admit to yourself right now," she said quietly. "And I think, whatever happens next, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that Celine will not simply accept last night's outcome, without some kind of response." Wren nodded slowly, understanding the truth of this warning, even as she wished desperately that it were not necessary. She had survived the gala, had survived Celine's carefully orchestrated humiliation, only through Cade's direct intervention, a rescue she had neither expected nor entirely known how to feel about, now that the immediate danger had passed. She thought of his words, spoken with such quiet conviction before the entire assembled hall, praising her integrity and character, with a sincerity that had left her breathless long after the moment itself had ended. She thought of the careful way he had extended his arm to walk her from the hall, a gesture of protection that every alpha present had understood immediately as something far more significant than simple courtesy toward a struggling candidate. Whatever this was growing between them, she realized, sitting quietly in the gray morning light with Isla's warning still ringing in her ears, it was no longer something either of them could easily pretend was simple curiosity or passing interest. And whatever came next, in a selection that had already proven itself far more dangerous and unpredictable than she had ever imagined, when Garrick first summoned her to his study weeks earlier, she suspected she would need every ounce of quiet resilience she had spent her entire life cultivating, simply to survive what remained ahead. Wren found herself standing outside Cade's study door for the second time in a week, though this time, she had come entirely on her own initiative, without any formal summons requiring her presence. She had spent the entire day since the gala, turning over the same restless question in her mind, unable to focus properly during the morning's trial, unable to eat more than a few bites during the communal meal that followed. Finally, as evening settled over the hold, she had made her way toward his private study, driven by a need for answers that had grown too insistent to ignore any longer. The guards stationed outside recognized her immediately, exchanging a brief glance before one of them knocked to announce her presence. A moment later, the door opened, and Cade himself stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from mild surprise to something more careful and attentive the instant he recognized her. "Wren," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry. I did not expect you tonight." She stepped past him into the study, her slate already gripped tightly in her hand, though she found herself uncertain, now that she stood directly before him, exactly how to begin the conversation she had spent the entire day rehearsing in her mind. Cade closed the door behind her, giving her the privacy she clearly needed, and waited, exactly as he had during their first audience, without pressing her to speak before she was ready. Finally, Ren lifted her slate and wrote the question that had haunted her since the previous evening. "Why did you defend me last night, in front of everyone?" Cade read the words slowly, his expression carefully composed, though Ren noticed a slight tension in his jaw that suggested the question required more consideration than he had initially expected. "Because what Celine did was cruel," he said finally, "and I do not tolerate cruelty within my hold, regardless of the rank or influence of the wolf responsible for it." Ren shook her head slightly, unsatisfied with the answer, and wrote again. "That is not a complete answer. You could have simply removed my name from the list quietly, before the gala even began. You chose instead to make a public statement, one that has certainly cost you something with the alphas whose support Celine's pack provides." Cade studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful expression, a decision being made that Ren could not quite read. He walked slowly toward the window of his study, staring out over the darkened courtyard below, his back to her for the first time since she had entered. "You are correct," he said eventually, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "I could have handled it quietly. I considered exactly that option, the night before the gala, when I first learned what Celine had arranged." Ren waited, sensing that he was working toward something he found difficult to say aloud, and resisted the urge to fill the silence with another written question, allowing him instead the same patience he had extended to her during their first audience. "I have spent my entire life," he continued finally, still facing the window, "surrounded by wolves who want something from me. My father's council wanted my obedience. My mother's allies wanted my loyalty to their particular vision of what this territory should become. Every alpha who has ever brought a daughter before me during a selection wants an alliance, a strategic advantage, a claim on the throne through marriage, rather than through any genuine desire to know the wolf who happens to sit upon it." He turned back to face her then, his expression unguarded in a way Ren had never witnessed before, not even during their private audience a week earlier. "You are the only candidate in this entire selection," he said, "who has never once tried to sell yourself to me. You did not perform devotion during the trials. You did not seek my attention during the gala. You have, if anything, spent every possible moment trying to remain as far from my notice as circumstances allowed." Ren's throat tightened with an emotion she could not quite name, and she found herself unable to look away from the raw sincerity in his expression. "I chose to defend you publicly," he said, "because I could not stand by and watch cruelty destroy the one genuine, unguarded thing I have witnessed in this entire selection. I have spent a week now, trying to convince myself that my interest in you was simple curiosity, the natural reaction of a king, intrigued by an unusual candidate. I no longer believe that is the complete truth." Ren's hands trembled as she lifted her slate once more, though the words she wrote came slower this time, more careful, more uncertain than any question she had asked him before. "What is the complete truth, then?" Cade crossed the room until he stood directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his gaze. "The complete truth," he said quietly, "is that I have not stopped thinking about you since the moment I watched you kneel beside a crying child in my kitchen, offering comfort you had no obligation to give, expecting nothing in return. I have watched you navigate every cruelty this selection has thrown at you, with more quiet strength than I have witnessed in wolves twice your age and rank, and I find myself, for the first time since I inherited this crown, genuinely curious what it might be like to know someone who wants nothing from me at all, except perhaps to be left alone." The confession hung in the air between them, heavier and more significant than anything either of them had said aloud since Ren first arrived at the hold. She felt something crack open in her chest, a wall she had spent her entire life carefully constructing around herself, brick by brick, ever since the night she lost both her voice and her mother in the same terrible hour. She reached, with trembling hands, for her slate one final time, writing the words slowly, carefully, aware that whatever she wrote next would shape the remainder of her time within these walls, regardless of how the selection itself eventually concluded. I do not know how to want something like this. I have spent my whole life making myself small enough that no one would ever expect anything from me. I am afraid of what it means to be seen the way you have been seeing me." Cade read her words with the same careful attention he had given every message she had ever written him, and when he finally looked up, his expression carried none of the impatience or disappointment she had braced herself to see. "Then we will learn together," he said simply. "I am not asking you to become someone you are not, Ren. I am asking only that you allow yourself the possibility that being truly seen does not have to mean being hurt." Something in his quiet certainty settled the frantic uncertainty that had gripped her chest since the gala's conclusion the night before. She thought of her mother, of the storage cellar where she had hidden as a child, of the years spent afterward learning that silence and invisibility were the only reliable protections against a world that seemed determined to hurt her whenever she dared to be noticed. She thought of Milo's simple, earnest words in the kitchen, "You don't need to talk to be nice, you're already the nicest one here," and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a small, tentative hope that perhaps the world did not have to remain exactly as cruel as her childhood had taught her to expect. She lifted her slate one final time that evening, and wrote a response that surprised even herself with its honesty. "I would like to try. I am simply afraid I do not know how." Cade's expression softened into something Ren had never seen from him before, a genuine, unguarded warmth that transformed his usually stern features entirely. "Neither do I," he admitted. "I have spent so long being what this territory needs me to be that I have nearly forgotten how to simply exist as myself around another person. Perhaps we can discover it together, one quiet conversation at a time." They talked for another hour that evening, the conversation flowing more easily than either of them had expected, moving through smaller, gentler topics that required no great emotional courage to share. Ren described her mother's recipes, the ones she still remembered clearly enough to recreate in Petra's kitchen. Cade described, haltingly at first, then with growing ease, small memories of his own parents from before the losses that had reshaped his entire childhood, memories he rarely shared with anyone, given how carefully he guarded every part of himself, from a territory that expected only strength from its king. By the time Ren finally left his study that night, walking back toward the dormitory through corridors grown quiet and dark, she carried with her a fragile, unfamiliar warmth that felt entirely different from the anxious confusion that had driven her there in the first place. She did not know yet what the remainder of the selection would bring, whether Celine's wounded pride would produce some new scheme more dangerous than the last, or whether the council would ever fully accept an Omega candidate as a legitimate contender for the Luna position, regardless of the king's evident favor. But she knew, walking through the darkened hold with her heart lighter than it had been in years, that whatever came next, she no longer faced it entirely alone. And for a girl who had spent her entire life believing that being unnoticed was the safest way to survive, that knowledge alone felt like the beginning of something she had never once allowed herself to hope for. Yet even as that fragile warmth carried her back toward the dormitory, a different kind of tension was building elsewhere within the hold, one Ren remained entirely unaware of, as she settled onto her cot that night, with the first genuinely peaceful thoughts she had allowed herself in weeks. Celine had spent the day since the gala in careful, controlled silence, offering no outward sign of the humiliation still burning beneath her composed exterior. She had attended the day's trial with her usual polished confidence, answered every question posed to her with flawless precision, and given no one in the dormitory any reason to suspect that anything had changed in her careful pursuit of the Luna position. But privately, she had spent every spare moment reconsidering her strategy entirely. The direct sabotage, the bribed rumors, the public setup at the gala, all of it had backfired spectacularly, drawing exactly the kind of protective response from Cade that she had least expected and could least afford. If she continued along the same path, attempting increasingly obvious schemes against Ren, she risked not simply failing to eliminate her rival, but destroying her own standing with the king entirely, along with whatever remained of her reputation among the watching alphas. She needed, she decided, a far more patient approach. Rather than attacking Ren directly, drawing attention and suspicion back to herself, she would instead focus on demonstrating her own superiority, so thoroughly, so undeniably, throughout the remaining trials, that the question of an Omega candidate's suitability for the Luna position would resolve itself naturally, without requiring any further intervention on her part at all. It was, she told herself, a wiser strategy regardless, one better suited to her own considerable talents, rather than the crude sabotage she had relied upon so far. She would simply need to trust that the council, and eventually the king himself, would recognize what should have been obvious from the very beginning, that a Luna required strength, eloquence, and diplomatic skill, that a silent Omega could never hope to fully provide, regardless of whatever passing fascination Cade currently harbored toward her. She allowed herself this reassurance, though a small, persistent doubt lingered at the edges of her confidence, impossible to fully banish no matter how firmly she tried to convince herself of her own inevitable success. She had never, in her entire life, encountered a rival she could not overcome through sheer force of will and careful strategy. She was not prepared to consider the possibility that this particular rival, quiet and unassuming as she appeared, might prove to be the exception that finally broke her long, unbroken record of triumph. Word of the growing closeness between Cade and Wren continued spreading through the dormitory over the following days, carried now not through cruel rumors, but through genuine, curious observation. Candidates noticed the king's occasional presence near the training courtyard when Wren's group was scheduled to practice. They noticed small kindnesses, extra portions offered discreetly at meals, a guard's careful attention whenever Wren walked the corridors alone in the evening. None of it was overt enough to constitute open favoritism that the council could formally object to, but it was enough to confirm, in the minds of thousands of watching candidates, that the silent Omega from a minor northern pack had somehow become a genuine contender for a position everyone had once assumed was reserved exclusively for candidates of far higher rank and polish. Wren herself remained cautiously uncertain how to navigate this shifting perception, uncomfortable with the renewed attention even as it came now wrapped in curiosity rather than cruelty. She continued attending every trial exactly as she had before, continued visiting Milo in the kitchen each evening, continued relying on Isla's steady friendship as the one constant she could depend upon amid the selection's increasingly unpredictable currents. But something had shifted within her as well, subtle and quiet, the same way a single crack of light through a long closed door eventually reveals an entire room beyond it. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowing herself to imagine a future beyond simple survival, a future in which her silence was not a weakness to be endured, but simply one part of who she was, accepted, and even valued, by someone whose opinion had come to matter more to her than she had ever expected it could. The final trials of the selection loomed ahead, and with them, she understood, would come the true test of everything that had grown between herself and Cade over these past 2 weeks. Whatever quiet understanding they had built in the privacy of his study would soon need to withstand the full weight of public scrutiny, council politics, and Celine's still unresolved determination to claim the position she had spent her entire life preparing to win. Wren did not yet know exactly what form that final test would take, but she understood, lying awake that night, with the memory of Cade's unguarded confession still warm in her chest, that whatever came next would demand more courage from her than anything she had faced so far, courage that would require her to step, finally and completely, out of the careful invisibility that had protected her for so long. Fire broke out in the eastern storage hall less than an hour into the final trial, and no one, at first, understood that it was not part of the exercise itself. The council had designed the 9th trial as the most demanding test of the entire selection, a full simulation of crisis leadership, in which the remaining candidates would be divided among several stations throughout the hold, each representing a different emergency a Luna might one day be required to manage. Smoke machines and controlled effects had been arranged in advance to simulate exactly this kind of disaster, and when the first plumes of gray smoke began curling from beneath the storage hall doors, most of the watching council members assumed, for several critical minutes, that everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Wren, stationed nearby at a neighboring exercise involving a simulated food shortage, felt something was wrong long before anyone else raised the alarm. The smoke carried a sharp, acrid quality that no controlled effect should have produced, and the heat radiating from the storage hall's stone walls felt far too intense for a simulation. She abandoned her own exercise immediately, ignoring the confused protests of her fellow candidates, and ran toward the storage hall just as the first genuine screams began echoing from within. The scene inside was chaos. A candle left burning too close to stacked hay bales had ignited an entire section of the storage hall, and the fire had spread with terrifying speed through the dry, flammable stores kept there for the hold's winter provisions. Several candidates assigned to that station stood frozen near the entrance, uncertain whether the flames were real or part of the trial itself, precious seconds lost to their confusion. Ren pushed past them without hesitation, her eyes catching sight of Fenna, the sharp-eyed Omega who had bested her in an early sparring match, trapped near the back of the hall where a collapsed support beam had blocked the most direct path to the exit. Fenna's leg was pinned beneath fallen debris, and smoke was rapidly filling the enclosed space, thick and choking, making it increasingly difficult to breathe or see clearly. Without pausing to consider the danger to herself, Ren grabbed a length of chain hanging near the entrance, one of several tools kept in the storage hall for moving heavy provisions, and pushed forward through the smoke toward Fenna's trapped form. Her eyes stung and watered immediately, her lungs burning with every breath. But she forced herself onward, guided as much by memory of the hall's layout from earlier deliveries as by actual sight through the thickening smoke. She reached Fenna within moments, working quickly to wedge the chain beneath the fallen beam, using it as leverage to lift the heavy wood, just enough for Fenna to drag her injured leg free. The other candidate cried out in pain as she moved, but managed, with Ren's support, to crawl clear of the debris entirely, both of them coughing violently from the smoke, now filling nearly the entire hall. Getting Fenna to her feet proved the next challenge, her injured leg unable to bear weight, and Ren, despite her own smaller frame, positioned herself beneath Fenna's arm, bracing herself against the weight as they made their slow, stumbling way back toward the entrance, through smoke so thick now that Ren could barely make out the doorway ahead of them. They emerged into the courtyard together, just as guards arrived with water buckets, and the first proper response to the fire finally began, both candidates collapsing onto the stone ground, coughing and gasping for clean air, Fenna's leg bent at an angle that made several onlookers wince in sympathy. The fire was brought under control within another 20 minutes, though the storage hall itself suffered significant damage, and it took considerably longer for the full chaos of the moment to settle into clear understanding among the council members and assembled candidates. Healers rushed to attend to Fenna's injured leg, and to check Ren for smoke inhalation, while Edmund and the rest of the council began the more difficult work of determining exactly what had happened, and why the fire had been allowed to spread so dangerously before anyone recognized it as a genuine emergency, rather than a simulated one. Cade arrived at the scene within minutes of the alarm finally being raised properly, his expression carrying a barely controlled fear that few in the hold had ever witnessed from their composed king. He found Ren still seated on the courtyard stones, wrapped in a blanket a healer had draped over her shoulders, her face streaked with soot, her breathing still ragged from the smoke she had inhaled. He knelt before her without any regard for who might be watching, his hands cupping her face gently as he searched her expression for any sign of serious injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with an urgency that left no doubt about the depth of his concern. Ren shook her head, though her throat felt raw and scraped from the smoke, worse even than its usual damaged state. She reached weakly for her slate, which a guard had retrieved from her fallen bag, and wrote with trembling hands, "Fenna was trapped. I could not leave her." Cade read the words, and something in his expression shifted from fear toward a fierce, overwhelming pride that he made no effort to hide from the gathering crowd of candidates and council members watching the scene unfold. "You ran into a burning building," he said, "for a candidate who once tried to injure you in a sparring match." Ren's hand moved again, slower now with exhaustion. She needed help. That was all that mattered. The simple clarity of her answer, offered without hesitation despite everything Fenna had once put her through, settled something in the watching crowd that no formal trial or council evaluation could ever have properly measured. This was not performed courage, not a calculated display meant to win favor before an audience. This was instinct, genuine and unguarded, exactly the same quality Cade had recognized in her from the very first night he watched her comfort a crying child in his kitchen. Fenna, once her leg had been properly examined and splinted, insisted on speaking before the full assembly gathered to review the day's events, despite the pain clearly evident in her expression. "She saved my life," Fenna said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "I have never been kind to her. I spread rumors about her early in this selection, believing the stories Celine told me about her past. She owed me nothing. She came for me anyway." The confirmation of Celine's involvement in the earlier rumors, delivered openly and without prompting by a candidate with no obvious reason to lie, finally provided the council with the confirmation they had lacked since first suspecting Celine's role in the sabotage weeks earlier. Edmund's expression hardened as he turned toward where Celine stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, her composed mask finally beginning to crack under the weight of public exposure she could no longer avoid. "Is this true?" Edmund asked her directly, his tone carrying none of the deference typically afforded an alpha's daughter. Celine's eyes darted briefly toward Cade, searching for some avenue of denial or deflection, but found none available to her. The evidence had finally accumulated too completely, too publicly, for any careful denial to hold against it. "I only wanted to protect my own position," she said finally, her voice tight with the first genuine emotion she had allowed herself to display throughout the entire selection. She was never supposed to become a genuine threat. "And so you chose cruelty," Cade said, his voice carrying the same cold authority he had used to silence the mocking crowd at the gala weeks earlier, rather than simply trusting your own considerable talents to speak for themselves. Celine had no response to offer that would not further condemn her, and the council, after brief private consultation, made the decision that had been building steadily since the gala itself. Celine Draven was formally removed from the selection. Her candidacy ended, not through any failure in the trials themselves, but through conduct the council determined entirely unsuitable for a future Luna. Her home pack would be informed of the decision, and whatever political consequences followed from her removal would need to be managed through more delicate diplomatic channels in the weeks ahead. Ren watched the proceedings with a strange, hollow feeling that carried none of the satisfaction she might once have expected from seeing her tormentor finally exposed and removed. There was no joy in it, only a quiet, tired relief that the danger Celine had represented throughout the selection had finally, definitively ended. The remaining candidates, watching the entire exchange unfold in stunned silence, understood clearly now that whatever quiet respect Ren had earned through her courage that day extended far beyond simple sympathy for her tragic past. She had proven, in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible, exactly the kind of character the selection's original trials had always claimed to seek, but had so often failed to properly measure. That evening, as healers finished treating the last of the injuries from the fire, and the hold slowly settled back into its usual rhythms, Cade found Ren resting in the infirmary, her throat still raw, her body exhausted from the day's ordeal. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her bed, "the council will announce the final candidates advancing to the last stage of the selection." Ren nodded, too exhausted to reach for her slate, simply meeting his gaze steadily instead. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Cade continued, his voice carrying a warmth she had come to recognize as reserved only for their private conversations, "I want you to know that today, you showed this entire hold exactly who you are. Regardless of rank, regardless of council rulings, regardless of anything that happens next in this selection, that truth will not change." Ren managed a small, tired smile, reaching finally for his hand instead of her slate, a simple gesture that required no written words at all to convey everything she felt in that exhausted, grateful moment. Cade held her hand gently, careful of the small burns along her fingers from her rush through the storage hall's debris, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence, as the infirmary's candles burned low, the coming morning's uncertain future waiting quietly, just beyond the horizon. News of Celine's removal spread through the hold faster than any rumor she herself had ever orchestrated, though this time, the story required no embellishment or bribed servants to carry it convincingly from bed to bed throughout the dormitory. Candidates who had once followed Celine's lead without question now spoke of her in careful, distant tones, unwilling to associate themselves too closely with a name the king himself had publicly condemned. Adelie, left without her closest ally and confidant, found herself suddenly adrift among candidates who had never particularly warmed to her beyond her usefulness as Celine's companion. She approached Isla the following morning, her usual confidence considerably diminished, and asked quietly whether Ren held any resentment toward her for her role in spreading the earlier rumors. Isla relayed the question to Ren later that day, and Ren considered it carefully before writing her response on a fresh sheet of parchment, no longer relying solely on her small slate, now that she had grown more comfortable expressing longer thoughts in writing. "Tell her I understand loyalty complicates judgment sometimes. I do not hold grudges against those who acted out of misplaced loyalty rather than genuine cruelty of their own. The message, relayed back to Attili through Isla, left the other candidate visibly moved, and in the days that followed, she made small, quiet efforts to correct the damage her earlier gossip had caused, defending Ren's character whenever the topic arose among the remaining candidates. It was not forgiveness offered easily, but it was forgiveness offered honestly. Exactly the kind of grace Ren had learned to extend even to those who had wronged her, having spent her entire life understanding all too well how easily fear and desperation could push a person toward choices they might not otherwise make. Fenna's recovery progressed steadily over the following days, her leg healing under the careful attention of the hold's healers, and she sought Ren out personally once she was well enough to move about without assistance, finding her in the kitchen one evening helping Petra prepare the following day's meals. "I do not know how to properly thank you," Fenna said, standing somewhat awkwardly near the kitchen entrance, "for what you did. Especially after everything I put you through in that sparring match, and everything I believed about you afterward because of Celine's lies." Ren wiped her hands on her apron and reached for a scrap of parchment kept nearby for exactly this purpose. "You do not owe me a debt. I would have done the same for any candidate trapped in that fire, regardless of our history." Fenna read the words slowly, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of gratitude and lingering shame. "I want you to know," she said finally, "that whatever happens in the final stage of this selection, you have earned my genuine respect. Not because the king favors you, but because you are, without question, the finest character I have encountered among every candidate gathered here." The words settled warmly in Ren's chest, another small piece of the isolation she had endured throughout much of the selection, finally beginning to heal, alongside the physical burns still marking her hands. She had come to this hold, expecting nothing but quiet suffering and eventual dismissal, certain that her rank and her silence would guarantee her invisibility throughout a process designed for candidates far more polished and confident than herself. Instead, she had found genuine friendship in Isla's steady loyalty, unexpected redemption in Fenna's honest gratitude, and something she had never once imagined possible in the quiet, unguarded warmth growing steadily between herself and the White Lycan King himself. Whatever the council's final decision brought tomorrow, she understood now, walking back toward the dormitory beneath a clear night sky scattered with distant stars, that she had already gained far more from this selection than she had ever thought herself capable of hoping for. The council chamber doors burst open before dawn, and Edmund's urgent summons pulled Cade from his study with a single sentence that changed the entire shape of the day ahead. "The Allied Alphas have arrived early, my lord, and they are demanding an immediate audience regarding the Draven Pack's removal from the selection." Cade dressed quickly, understanding immediately the political storm that Celine's public expulsion had inevitably set into motion. Her father, Alpha Draven, commanded one of the largest and most strategically valuable Allied territories in the region, and his daughter's humiliating removal from the selection, however thoroughly justified, represented exactly the kind of diplomatic complication that could unravel years of carefully maintained alliance if handled poorly. He found the council chamber already crowded when he arrived, 7 Allied Alphas seated around the long table alongside his own council members, their expressions ranging from carefully neutral to openly hostile. Alpha Draven himself sat at the center, his broad shoulders tense with barely restrained anger, clearly prepared to demand an explanation he intended to reject regardless of what reasoning Cade offered. "My daughter," Alpha Draven began the moment Cade took his seat, "was humiliated and removed from this selection, based on the testimony of a candidate with every reason to lie about her involvement in a simple accident." "Your daughter," Cade replied evenly, "orchestrated a deliberate campaign of sabotage and public humiliation against another candidate. Actions confirmed not only by the testimony you dismiss so easily, but by physical evidence, traced directly back to servants she bribed for exactly that purpose." The exchange continued for the better part of an hour, Alpha Draven pressing every possible argument to reverse the council's decision, while Cade calmly but firmly refused to yield ground on a matter he considered entirely settled. The other Allied Alphas watched carefully, several of them privately relieved that their own daughters had avoided similar entanglements, while others seemed genuinely curious to see how their king would navigate a conflict that tested both his authority and his diplomatic judgment simultaneously. Finally, Recognizing that his anger would achieve nothing further against a king unwilling to reconsider, Alpha Draven shifted his approach entirely. "Then at least tell me," he said, his tone considerably cooler now, "who this candidate is. That my daughter's entire future has been sacrificed for her sake. I have heard rumors throughout this territory that you have taken a particular interest in an Omega from some minor northern pack." The chamber fell silent, every eye turning toward Cade, waiting to see how he would answer a question that struck directly at the heart of everything he had been carefully navigating since the very first night of the selection. Cade considered his answer for a long moment, understanding that whatever he said next would shape not only the remainder of this contentious meeting, but quite possibly the entire trajectory of the selection's final stage. He thought of Ren, resting still in the infirmary from yesterday's ordeal, her quiet courage and unguarded honesty having become, over these past weeks, the single most important thing in a life otherwise consumed entirely by duty and calculation. "Her name is Ren Calloway," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "And she is the finest candidate this selection has produced, regardless of the rank she was assigned upon arrival." The declaration, offered without hesitation or qualification, settled over the chamber with the weight of an announcement far more significant than a simple defense of the council's earlier decision. Several of the allied alphas exchanged meaningful glances, understanding immediately that their king had just confirmed, in the most direct terms possible, exactly where his genuine interest in this selection now rested. Alpha Draven's expression darkened further, though he said nothing more on the matter, recognizing perhaps that continued argument would only further damage his own standing, rather than restore his daughter's position. The meeting concluded shortly after, the allied alphas departing with considerably more information than they had arrived possessing, though whatever private conversations followed among their own advisors remained, for now, beyond Cade's immediate concern. The final trial of the selection took place 3 days later, delayed slightly to allow the political tensions surrounding Celine's removal to settle, before the hold's attention turned fully toward the process's dramatic conclusion. The remaining candidates, now numbering only 15 after weeks of careful elimination, gathered in the Great Hall for what the council had designed as the ultimate test of leadership, a formal presentation before every remaining alpha and council member, in which each candidate would demonstrate exactly what vision she held for the territory's future, under her guidance as Luna. Ren, her hands still bearing faint marks from the fire, her throat still occasionally raw from the smoke she had inhaled, stood among the remaining candidates with a calm she had never expected herself capable of feeling before such an audience. She had spent the previous 2 days preparing carefully, working alongside Isla to craft a presentation that relied entirely on written testimony and careful visual demonstration, rather than any spoken words she simply could not offer. When her turn finally came, she stepped forward, not with the frightened, downcast posture that had characterized her very first trial weeks earlier, but with a quiet, steady confidence that had grown slowly and genuinely over the course of the entire selection. She presented a detailed written proposal for improving conditions among the hold's lowest-ranked pack members, drawing directly from her own experience as an Omega, and her weeks spent quietly observing the daily struggles of servants and kitchen staff throughout the hold, people whose concerns the council's more polished candidates had scarcely considered worth addressing at all. Her proposal detailed practical improvements, better medical care for injured children like Milo, fairer distribution of winter provisions learned from her own pack's practices, and a formal system allowing servants and lower-ranked wolves a voice in matters that directly affected their daily lives. The council listened with genuine attentiveness, several members taking careful notes as she presented each point through a combination of written testimony read aloud by Isla, and simple, clear gestures Ren had practiced extensively to convey her meaning without requiring speech at all. When she finished, the hall remained quiet for a long moment before Edmund himself broke the silence. "This is, without question, the most thorough and genuinely compassionate proposal this selection has produced," he said, his earlier skepticism about Ren's ranking entirely replaced now by open admiration. "You have identified concerns that every other candidate has overlooked entirely." The remaining candidates' presentations continued throughout the day, each offering their own vision for the territory's future, though none carried the same quiet, genuine conviction that Ren's had demonstrated. By evening, as the final trial concluded and the council retired to deliberate their final assessment, the entire hold buzzed with anticipation, understanding that tomorrow would finally bring the selection's ultimate conclusion. Cade summoned Ren to his study one final time that evening, though this visit carried none of the anxious uncertainty that had accompanied her very first audience weeks earlier. She entered freely now, comfortable in his presence in a way she had never imagined possible when Garrick first sent her away from her pack's territory. "Tomorrow," Cade said, once she had settled into the chair across from his desk, "I will announce my final choice before the entire assembly. Alphas, council members, and every remaining candidate together." Ren nodded, understanding the gravity of what tomorrow would bring, though she found herself, for the first time, genuinely uncertain what outcome she truly hoped for. She had come to this hold, wanting nothing more than to survive the selection quietly and return home unnoticed. She had found instead something she had never expected to find: genuine friendship, unexpected respect, and a connection with the king himself that had grown, slowly and carefully, into something she could no longer easily name as anything other than love. "Whatever I choose tomorrow," Cade said, his voice carrying the same quiet sincerity she had come to treasure in their private conversations. "I want you to know that these past weeks have changed something in me that I do not believe can ever fully return to how it was before. You have taught me what it means to be known by someone who wants nothing from me except my genuine self." Ren reached for a small piece of parchment, writing her response slowly, savoring this quiet moment before whatever tomorrow's formal announcement would bring. "Whatever you choose, I am grateful for everything this selection has given me already. I no longer feel like the invisible Omega who arrived here weeks ago, believing she had nothing worth offering anyone." Cade read her words, and something in his expression settled into quiet, unshakable certainty. "You never were invisible," he said. "You were simply waiting for someone patient enough to truly look." The formal announcement took place the following afternoon. The great hall filled beyond capacity, with every remaining candidate, every allied alpha, and the entire council, assembled to witness the selection's dramatic conclusion. Cade stood before the crowd, his expression carrying none of the careful, guarded neutrality that had characterized him throughout the earlier trials, replaced instead by a quiet confidence that seemed to settle the entire hall into attentive silence the moment he began speaking. "Weeks ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast chamber, "thousands of candidates gathered before these gates, each believing that strength, eloquence, and confident ambition would determine who among them deserved to stand beside their king as Luna. I confess that I believed something similar myself when this selection began." He paused, his eyes finding Ren where she stood among the remaining candidates, her expression carefully composed despite the pounding of her heart beneath her simple gray gown. "I was wrong," he continued. "A Luna's true worth is not measured by how loudly she can declare her devotion, or how skillfully she can perform strength before a watching crowd. It is measured by what she does when she believes no one of importance is watching at all. It is measured by the courage to run into a burning building for a rival who once wronged her. It is measured by quiet, genuine compassion for those the rest of the world considers beneath its notice." The hall remained utterly silent, every alpha and council member understanding exactly where this declaration was heading, even before Cade spoke the words that would formally conclude the selection. "I choose," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "Ren Calloway, of the pack of Garrick Wells, to stand beside me as Luna of this territory." The hall erupted, not entirely with celebration, several of the remaining candidates' expressions carrying visible disappointment, but the overwhelming reaction among the assembled crowd was one of genuine approval, particularly among the allied alphas who had witnessed, over these past weeks, exactly the character Cade now publicly praised. Fenna, standing near the front of the remaining candidates despite her still healing leg, was among the first to offer a genuine, warm smile of congratulations. Ren stepped forward as Cade extended his hand toward her, the same gesture of protection and respect he had offered weeks earlier at the gala, though this time, the gesture carried an entirely different, far more permanent significance. She took his hand, her own steady now despite the enormity of the moment, and allowed him to draw her gently to stand beside him before the entire assembled crowd. She would never fully regain the voice she had lost as a child, would never be able to offer the eloquent declarations of devotion that thousands of candidates had once believed were required to win a king's favor. But standing there beside Cade Ashwood, the white Lycan king, who had looked past every trial's narrow measure of worth, to see the quiet, genuine strength she had carried within herself all along, Ren understood finally, and completely, that her silence had never been the weakness the world had once taught her to believe it was. It had simply been waiting, all this time, for someone patient enough and wise enough to listen. News of the announcement traveled far beyond the walls of Ashwood Hold within days, carried by messengers to every territory allied with the White Lycan King, and eventually, to the quiet northern pack Ren had once believed she would never see again, except in memory. Garrick Wells, upon hearing that the Omega he had dismissed so carelessly weeks earlier had been chosen as Luna over thousands of far more celebrated candidates, found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to his own pack exactly why he had sent away, without a second thought, the woman who would now hold considerable influence over the entire territory's future. Ren, for her part, harbored no interest in punishing her former alpha for the dismissive way he had treated her. She had learned, over the course of the selection, that holding on to old grievances served no purpose beyond weighing down a heart that had finally been given room to breathe freely for the first time in years. Instead, she used her new position to advocate quietly but firmly for changes she had witnessed the need for throughout her own life as an Omega, ensuring that packs across the territory understood clearly that rank alone would never again determine a wolf's true worth in the eyes of their Luna. Milo, still living within the hold with his mother among the kitchen staff, became one of the first children to benefit from the new medical provisions Ren established in the months following her formal appointment as Luna. He visited her often in her new chambers, proudly showing off his continued progress with the hand signs she had first taught him during those early, uncertain days of the selection, and Ren never once failed to make time for him, regardless of how many other duties now filled her days as Luna of the territory. Isla remained a close and trusted companion throughout the transition, eventually taking on a formal role within Ren's household, her steady loyalty finally rewarded with the kind of genuine friendship and stability she had offered so freely during the selection's most difficult weeks. Fenna, once her leg fully healed, returned to her own pack's territory, though she and Ren maintained a correspondence built on the mutual respect that had grown from an unlikely act of courage inside a burning storage hall. As for Cade, the cold, unreadable king the entire territory had once known, those who worked closely within the hold noticed, gradually, but unmistakably, a warmth in him that had never been visible before Ren's arrival. He still carried himself with the same quiet authority that had commanded thousands of frightened candidates into orderly silence on the very first night of the selection. But something had softened at the edges, a genuine ease that settled over him whenever Ren was near, an ease that even the most seasoned council members eventually came to recognize as simple, uncomplicated happiness. Years later, when younger wolves within the territory asked how their Luna, famously unable to speak, had won the heart of the fiercest king their lands had ever known, the story was told and retold throughout every pack, evolving slightly with each new telling, the way all such stories eventually do. But the heart of it remained unchanged through every version, a silent Omega who arrived at Ashwood Hold expecting nothing but quiet survival, and who left it instead having taught the most powerful wolf in the entire territory exactly what it meant to be truly, unguardedly seen. And in the quiet moments between the demands of ruling a vast territory, when Cade and Ren found themselves alone together, exactly as they had been during those first careful conversations in his private study, neither of them needed words at all to understand exactly how far they had come, together, since the night thousands of candidates gathered outside the gates of Ashwood Hold, each hoping to win a king's heart, never imagining that he would choose, in the end, the silent Omega no one else had thought to truly see.